I never imagined a bowl of French onion soup would change my life forever. My name's Rebecca, and 6 months ago, I was living what seemed like a perfect life in a waterfront condo in Seattle, running my own successful interior design firm, married to a man everyone called the charming doctor. Funny how quickly your whole world can dissolve, just like the melted cheese in that fateful bowl of soup. Looking back now, I can trace the exact moment my life started to unravel. It was a rainy Tuesday evening in October, the kind of dreary, Seattle night where the city lights blur into watercolor smudges against the darkness. James and I were sitting at our usual table at Le Petit Bistrot, the French restaurant where we'd had our first date 5 years ago. The same place where he'd proposed 3 years later, getting down on one knee between the appetizer and main course. That night was supposed to be a celebration. Earlier that day, I'd received the news that my grandmother Rose had left me her entire estate, including her historic Victorian mansion in Vancouver and a substantial investment portfolio she'd built over decades of shrewd business decisions. Gran had always been my rock, the woman who taught me everything from color theory to contract negotiation. While other grandmothers were baking cookies, she was teaching me how to read financial statements and negotiate with contractors. James had seemed supportive when I first told him about the inheritance, kissing my forehead and holding me while I cried over the loss of Gran. But sitting there in Le Petit Bistrot, watching him stir his soup with calculated precision, I noticed something different in his eyes. Something cold and calculating that I'd never seen before, or maybe had chosen not to see. "We need to discuss what this means for our future," he said, his voice carrying that authoritative tone he usually reserved for his medical residents. "This inheritance could set us up for life, especially if we invest it properly. I've already been looking at some opportunities." I took a sip of wine, trying to ignore the way my stomach tightened at his words. "I was thinking of using part of it to expand my design firm," I said carefully. "Maybe open a second location in Vancouver, near Gran's house. She always believed in my work, even when—" "Your little decorating business?" James cut me off with a laugh that felt like ice water down my spine. "Come on, Becca. This is serious money we're talking about. We need to think bigger. I've been talking to some colleagues about a private medical practice, with your inheritance as capital." "My inheritance," I repeated, the words feeling strange on my tongue. "James, this is Gran's legacy to me. She specifically left it in my name." "We're married, Rebecca," he said, his voice dropping to that dangerous quiet that always preceded a storm. "What's yours is mine. That's how marriage works. Or have you forgotten your vows?" I looked at my husband then, really looked at him. His perfectly pressed shirt, his expertly styled hair, the way he held his soup spoon like a scalpel. When had he become this stranger? Or had he always been this person, and I'd just been too blinded by his charm to notice? "I haven't forgotten anything," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "But this is my grandmother's gift to me, and I want to honor her wishes. She believed in my business, James. She saw value in what I do, even if you don't." That's when it happened. One moment James was sitting there, his face a mask of controlled anger, and the next, his hand was moving with surgical precision. The bowl of steaming French onion soup flew across the table, its contents hitting my face and chest with shocking force. The heat was immediate, searing, but worse than the physical pain was the look in his eyes, cold, calculated, satisfied. The restaurant fell silent. I could feel the burn of the soup mixing with the burn of humiliation as other diners turned to stare. A server rushed over with napkins, her face a mask of horror. But all I could focus on was James, calmly wiping, his hands on his napkin as if he'd just finished a satisfying meal. "Now look what you made me do," he said quietly, his voice carried easily in the stunned silence. "If you'd just been reasonable about this." In that moment, as I sat there, Dripping with soup and shame, something crystallized in my mind. This wasn't just about the inheritance or the soup. This was about power, control, and a truth I'd been avoiding for far too long. My grandmother's voice echoed in my head, something she'd told me years ago. The moment someone tries to dim your light, that's the moment you need to shine brightest. I stood up slowly, soup still dripping from my chin, and looked down at this man I'd thought I knew. "We're done," I said, my voice clear and steady despite the chaos in my chest. The words felt like freedom, like finally opening the windows, in a room that had been sealed for too long. As I walked out of Le Petit Bistro that night, leaving James calling after me about being dramatic, I had no idea what would come next. I just knew that something had ended, and something else, something stronger, was beginning to take its place. Before that night at Le Petit Bistro, I thought I had mastered the art of balancing it all. My design firm, Rebecca Shaw Interiors, had just landed a contract to renovate 3 luxury penthouses in downtown Seattle. Our Instagram following had hit 100,000, and Coastal Living magazine had featured one of my waterfront projects in their spring issue. From the outside, everything looked picture perfect, just like the carefully curated rooms I designed for my clients. James and I lived in a glass-walled condo on the 27th floor of the Emerald Tower, with views of Elliott Bay that made every sunset feel like a private show. Every morning I'd wake up early to watch the ferries cutting white paths through the gray water, sipping my artisanal coffee while James slept in after his hospital night shifts. I'd trained myself to move silently during these moments, careful not to disturb his rest. "A surgeon needs steady hands," he'd remind me if I accidentally woke him, his voice carrying that edge that always made me feel slightly guilty. Our routine was as precisely choreographed as one of my room layouts. James would leave for the hospital by 7, and I'd head to my studio in Pioneer Square, a converted brick warehouse space that perfectly balanced historic charm with modern functionality. My team of 5, all women, which James sometimes commented on with raised eyebrows, would already be there, working on mood boards or sourcing materials for our latest projects. "You're so lucky," my assistant Morgan would often say, her eyes wide with admiration. "Dr. James is so supportive of your career. Most surgeons' wives I know just do charity work and plan hospital fundraisers." I'd smile and nod, ignoring the knot that formed in my stomach whenever someone praised James's support. They didn't see how he'd scrutinize every business expense, questioning whether I really needed that new 3D rendering software, or if another interior design conference was worth the investment. "Your business is doing well enough," he'd say, studying our joint account statements with the same intensity he reserved for patient charts. "But it's just interior design, Becca. It's not like you're saving lives." He'd laugh then, making it sound like a joke, but the message was always clear. My work was decorative, frivolous, while his was important and meaningful. Still, I'd convinced myself I was happy. We hosted dinner parties where James would charm our guests with stories from the operating room, while I served carefully plated meals that I'd spent hours preparing. He liked everything just so: the temperature of the wine, the arrangement of the table settings, the topics of conversation. I'd learned to anticipate his preferences, to smooth any potential wrinkles before they could disrupt his perfect image of our life. My grandmother Rose was the only one who ever questioned this arrangement. During our weekly Sunday calls, she'd listen to my carefully edited updates about work and home, then ask questions that made me squirm. "Are you still pursuing that commercial design certification you talked about?" she'd inquire. Or, "Whatever happened to your plans for a Vancouver branch?" When I'd explain that James thought it wasn't the right time, she'd go quiet in that way that spoke volumes. "Remember, little bird," she'd say, using the nickname she'd given me. When I was small, a cage is still a cage, even if it's made of gold. I'd laugh off her concerns, telling her she was old-fashioned, that modern marriages were about compromise. But late at night, when James was at the hospital and I was alone in our perfectly appointed condo, Her words would echo in my mind. The last time I saw Gran alive, just 2 weeks before she passed, she'd taken my hands in hers and looked at me with those piercing blue eyes that seemed to see straight through any pretense. "You're dimming your light, Rebecca," she said. "I see it happening, bit by bit. That spark you used to have when you talked about design, about creating spaces that transform people's lives, it's flickering." I'd dismissed her concerns, telling her about the magazine feature, the growing Instagram following, the successful projects. But she just shook her head. "Numbers and appearances," she said. "I'm talking about passion, about joy. When was the last time you designed something just because it lit you up inside?" I didn't have an answer then. Instead, I changed the subject to her health, to her medications, to safer topics that didn't probe so close to truths I wasn't ready to face. Now, looking back, I realized she knew exactly what she was doing when she structured her will the way she did. Gran had always seen what I couldn't or wouldn't see for myself. The day before everything fell apart at Le Petit Bistrot, I'd found myself standing in Gran's Victorian mansion, now my Victorian mansion, running my hands along the intricate woodwork she'd so lovingly preserved. The house needed updates. The kitchen was stuck in the 80s, and the bathrooms had seen better days, but its bones were solid, its spirit intact. Standing there in her library, surrounded by the books and art she'd collected over a lifetime, I felt something stirring in my chest, the first flickers of a dream I'd almost forgotten I had. I'd pulled out my sketchbook, the nice one James said was too expensive, and started drawing. Ideas flowed faster than I could capture them. A design studio in the converted carriage house, a showcase of Pacific Northwest artisans in the formal parlor, workshops for aspiring designers in the conservatory. For the first time in years, I felt that spark Gran had talked about, the pure joy of creating without constraints. If only I'd known then how quickly that spark would ignite a fire that would burn my carefully constructed life to the ground. But maybe that's exactly what needed to happen. Maybe, like the phoenix roses Gran loved to grow in her garden, something more beautiful was waiting to emerge from the ashes. The reading of Gran's will took place in her lawyer's office in Vancouver, a sleek downtown space that couldn't have been more different from her Victorian mansion. Michael Chen, her attorney for over 30 years, sat behind his desk with the kind of calm authority that reminded me of Gran herself. James had insisted on coming with me, rearranging his surgery schedule in a way that he'd made sure to mention 3 times during our drive up from Seattle. "As you know, Rose was very specific about her wishes," Michael began, adjusting his reading glasses. I could feel James sitting straighter beside me, his hand finding mine in what might have looked like a supportive gesture to others. But I felt the subtle pressure of his fingers, just this side of too tight. What followed was a carefully orchestrated dismantling of James's expectations. Not only had Gran left me the Vancouver mansion, but also her investment portfolio worth over $2 million, her art collection, and complete ownership of the historic block where her house stood, including the carriage house and 3 additional commercial buildings, all currently leased to local businesses. "She was very explicit," Michael continued, pulling out another document. "The entire estate is to be held in a trust under Rebecca's name alone, with provisions for maintaining the historic nature of the properties and supporting local arts initiatives." I felt James's hand tighten further on mine, but I kept my face neutral, years of practice helping me maintain the calm expression I'd perfected for difficult client meetings. Inside, though, my heart was racing. Gran hadn't just left me property, she'd left me a purpose. "There must be some consideration for joint marital assets," James said, his doctor's voice slipping slightly, revealing the edge beneath. "After all, Rebecca and I have shared finances." Michael's response was polite but firm. "The trust is quite clear, Dr. Harrison. Mrs. Rose was very specific about maintaining the separation of these assets. She also left this letter for Rebecca." He held out a cream-colored envelope with my name written in Gran's elegant hand. The drive back to Seattle was tense, filled with the kind of silence that feels like a held breath before a storm. James gripped the steering wheel of his Tesla, his knuckles white while I sat with Gran's unopened letter in my lap. The gesture of waiting to read it hadn't earned me any points. James's jaw remained clenched, his eyes fixed on the road with the same intensity he usually reserved for complex surgical procedures. "We need to be smart about this," he finally said as we crossed the border back into the States. "That kind of money needs proper management. I know some excellent financial advisors through the hospital board." Gran already had financial advisors, I interrupted, surprising myself. Michael says they've managed her portfolio for years, and they understand her vision for the properties. James's laugh was sharp, dismissive. Her vision? Becca, be realistic. That's our money now. We can't let some old woman's sentimental attachments dictate our future. The casual cruelty of his words, "some old woman," hit me like a physical blow. This was my grandmother he was talking about, the woman who'd taught me to trust my eye for design, who'd bought me my first set of professional drafting tools, who'd encouraged me to start my own firm instead of working for someone else. "I want to honor her wishes," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "The trust is set up to maintain the historic properties and support local artists. It's what she wanted." What she wanted? James took his eyes off the road to stare at me. "She's dead, Rebecca. This is about what we want, what I want. Think about what this could mean for my practice, for our future." The way he said "our future" made it clear he meant his future. In that moment, I saw something I'd been avoiding for years. How every decision, every plan, every dream had somehow become about him. My design firm was the business I let you play with. Our home was the condo I bought us. Never mind that my firm's success had contributed significantly to the down payment. Even my time was categorized according to his priorities. There were important events like hospital fundraisers and dinners with his colleagues, and unnecessary commitments like my client meetings or industry conferences. I looked down at the letter in my lap, at my name in Gran's handwriting, and made a decision. Without warning, I tore open the envelope, pulling out several pages covered in her familiar script. "What are you doing?" James demanded. "We should review that together with our lawyer." "It's addressed to me," I said, and began to read. The first lines made my throat tight. "My dearest little bird, if you're reading this, it means I've finally found a way to help you spread your wings." What followed was pages of memories, wisdom, and carefully laid plans. Gran hadn't just left me money and property, she'd left me a roadmap to independence. The trust was structured to prevent any interference with my control of the assets. The commercial properties provided steady income. She'd even set up a separate account to fund the design school I'd once dreamed of starting. The possessive "our" in his statement made my skin crawl. "James, we need to talk about this. The inheritance isn't part of our joint finances. Gran set it up specifically." "Don't be naive, Rebecca," he cut me off, his voice taking on that condescending tone he used when explaining simple medical concepts to patients. "Marriage means shared assets. Your grandmother's outdated notions about financial independence don't apply to our situation." I thought about Gran's letter, safely, stored in my desk at work. About her words, "Remember, little bird, independence isn't selfish, it's essential." Taking a deep breath, I stood my ground. Actually, they do apply. The trust is legally structured to remain separate, and I intend to honor Gran's wishes. The change in his expression was subtle but chilling, like watching a mask slip, slightly out of place. "We'll see about that," he said quietly. "I've already spoken with our lawyer." "Your lawyer," I corrected, surprising myself. "Michael Chen is handling the trust." James's laugh was cold. "Michael Chen is a family lawyer in Vancouver." "Richard," he emphasized his lawyer's first name, reminding me of their golf club connection. thinks we have several options for challenging the trust structure. That night, I lay awake listening to James's steady breathing beside me, my mind racing. When had my husband become someone who plotted to circumvent my grandmother's final wishes? Or had he always been this person, and I just refused to see it? The next morning, I made 2 calls. One to Michael Chen, alerting him to James's potential legal challenge, and one to my bank, opening a separate account, something Gran had specifically advised in her letter. Small acts of self-preservation. That felt simultaneously terrifying and liberating. The rest of the week passed in a blur of passive-aggressive comments and thinly veiled demands. James accidentally scheduled a dinner with hospital investors during my important client presentation. He questioned every business expense that came up on our joint credit card. He even showed up unannounced at my studio, claiming he was in the neighborhood and wanted to see what keeps you so busy. Through it all, I maintained a facade of normalcy, but inside, something was shifting. Each controlling gesture, each dismissive comment, each attempt to override my autonomy added to a growing certainty. This wasn't love, it was ownership. And like one of my design projects, once I saw the flaw in the foundation, I couldn't unsee it. By the time James suggested dinner at Le Petit Bistrot, I should have recognized it for what it was, a calculated move to pressure me in a public setting where he thought I'd be more likely to acquiesce to his demands. But I didn't. I walked right into that restaurant, wearing my favorite ivory silk blouse, about to learn exactly how far my husband would go to maintain control. Le Petit Bistrot hadn't changed since our first date. The same soft amber lighting, the same antique mirrors lining the walls, the same French jazz playing softly in the background. Our regular table was in the corner by the window, where the city lights created a romantic backdrop that had once made my heart flutter. Now, those same lights felt like spotlights in an interrogation room. James ordered for both of us, as he always did. French onion soup to start, followed by coq au vin for him and salmon en papillote for me. "Remember our first date here?" he asked, reaching across the table to take my hand. His thumb traced circles on my palm in a gesture that used to feel loving, but now felt calculating. "You were so nervous you spilled wine on your dress. And you were so understanding about it," I replied, remembering how charmed I'd been by his graceful handling of the situation. Now I wondered if that had been the beginning, his first demonstration of how he could manage my accidents, my mistakes, my life. The soup arrived, steam rising from the brown ceramic bowls like spirits trying to escape. I watched James methodically break through the melted Gruyere, his surgical precision on display, even in this simple act. He was building up to something. I could feel it in the air between us, heavy with unspoken demands. "I had an interesting meeting with the hospital board today," he began, spooning up the rich broth. "They're very interested in expanding our pediatric surgery wing. The timing would be perfect, with your inheritance coming through." I set my spoon down, the silver making a soft clink against the tablecloth. "James, we've been through this. The inheritance is in a trust. It's meant for specific purposes." "Purposes that can be amended," he countered, his voice taking on that reasonable tone he used to convince patients to opt for more expensive procedures. "Think about it, Rebecca. A children's surgery wing would save lives. What's more important, saving children or maintaining some old buildings?" The manipulation was so obvious it almost made me laugh. Almost. Those old buildings house local artists and small businesses. They're part of Vancouver's heritage, and Gran protected them for a reason. "Your grandmother," James said, his voice hardening, "is dead. This isn't about her anymore. This is about our future. My future." And there it was, the truth slipping out. Not our future. His future. "No," I said quietly, but firmly. "This is about my inheritance, my grandmother's wishes, and my choice." James set his spoon down with surgical precision, Your choice? His laugh was cold enough to freeze the steam rising from our soup bowls. When did you become so selfish? Rebecca? So small-minded? This is exactly why women shouldn't handle significant financial decisions. You're too emotional, too attached to sentimental nonsense. Each word hit like a slap, but I held my ground. I'm not being emotional, I'm being responsible. Gran built something meaningful, something that helps people. Helps people. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to that dangerous quiet I'd learned to fear. Interior design and art galleries help people. While I'm saving lives, you're picking out paint colors and playing with fabric swatches. And now you're going to use your grandmother's money to enable more of this useless frivolity? I thought about the letters I'd received from clients over the years. The mother who cried when I transformed her autistic son's room into a sensory-friendly haven. The elderly couple whose accessible bathroom design let them stay in their beloved home. The domestic violence shelter whose renovation provided dignity and hope to its residents. But I knew James wouldn't understand or care about any of that. My work has value, I said, my voice stronger than I expected, and so did Gran's vision. I won't let you destroy either. The change in his expression was subtle, a tightening around the eyes, a slight twitch in his jaw. If I hadn't spent years studying his faces, I might have missed it. But I knew that look. It was the same one he got when a resident questioned his judgment or a patient refused his recommended treatment. Let me, he said softly, dangerously. Let me? His hand moved toward his soup bowl, and some part of me knew what was coming, but I was frozen in place, watching with a strange detachment as he lifted it. The trajectory of the soup seemed to happen in slow motion. I saw the dark liquid arc through the air, the chunks of bread and onion suspended like asteroids, the melted cheese trailing like a comet's tail. Then time snapped back to normal speed as the scalding liquid hit my face and chest. The pain was immediate and intense. The soup had been steaming hot, and now it was burning its way down my skin, seeping through my silk blouse, creating a constellation of pain points across my chest and neck. But worse than the physical pain was the absolute silence that followed, the entire restaurant holding its breath in collective shock. Now look what you made me do, James said calmly, dabbing his mouth with his napkin as if he'd just finished a satisfying meal. If you'd just been reasonable about this. That's when I saw our reflection in one of the antique mirrors. Me, dripping with soup, skin reddening from the burn, and James sitting there perfectly composed, not a hair out of place. The image crystallized everything. The careful facade he maintained, the violence he was capable of, the years of subtle control that had led to this moment. A server appeared with napkins, her hands shaking slightly as she offered them to me. Madame, should I call someone? No need, James answered for me, his doctor voice firmly in place. My wife isn't feeling well. She gets emotional sometimes, you understand. Just bring the check. But I wasn't listening to him anymore. I was watching my reflection in that mirror, watching as soup dripped down my face, and seeing something else entirely. The prison I'd built around myself, bar by careful bar, each one made of compromises and concessions and careful silences. Actually, I said, standing up slowly, do call someone. Call the police. The look of shock on James's face would have been satisfying if I hadn't been so focused on the burning sensation spreading across my skin. As I walked out of Le Petit Bistro that night, I heard him calling after me, his voice switching between concern and anger, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Because for the first time in years, I was moving forward instead of standing still, and even through the pain, it felt like freedom. The Seattle night air hit my soup-soaked skin like a shock of reality. October rain was falling, in that typical Northwest mist, mixing with the cooling soup on my face and creating an absurd blend of French onion and rainwater that would have been funny if it wasn't so horrifying. My silk blouse was ruined, patches of angry red skin visible through the translucent fabric where the hot soup had burned me. I made it half a block before the adrenaline started to wear off and the pain really set in. My chest and neck felt like they were on fire, and I could feel blisters forming. A group of young women on a girls' night out stopped in their tracks when they saw me. "Oh my God, are you okay?" one of them asked, stepping forward with concern. She was wearing a medical ID badge from Swedish Medical Center. Lauren Thompson, RN. "My husband." I started, then stopped, the words sticking in my throat. How do you tell strangers that the respected pediatric surgeon they probably admired had just thrown scalding soup in your face over an inheritance dispute? Lauren seemed to understand anyway. "This needs medical attention," she said firmly, her nurse's training kicking in. "These are second-degree burns. Let me call." "You an Uber to the ER?" "No," I cut her off, suddenly panicked. "Not the ER. Not where he works." The thought of being treated by James's colleagues, of having this incident become hospital gossip, made me feel physically ill. "There's an urgent care clinic 3 blocks from here," another of the women offered. "My cousin works there. They're open late." Lauren and her friends insisted on accompanying me. As we walked, I learned they were all nurses celebrating a colleague's promotion. The irony of being rescued by medical professionals while fleeing from my surgeon husband wasn't lost on me. The urgent care clinic was quiet at this hour. The nurse practitioner who treated me, a woman named Diane with kind eyes and efficiency in her movements, didn't comment on the oddness of my injuries, but I saw her making careful notes as she documented the burns. "These need to be photographed," she said gently. "For medical purposes, of course, but also—" She let the sentence hang, and I knew what she wasn't saying. Evidence, in case I needed it later. While Diane treated my burns, Lauren sat with me, her presence both comforting and professional. She helped me contact Morgan, who arrived 20 minutes later with a change of clothes and a determination I'd never seen in my usually cheerful assistant. "I called Michael Chen," Morgan said, setting down her bag. "He's catching the first flight down from Vancouver tomorrow morning." When I started to protest, she held up her hand. "Rebecca, your husband threw hot soup in your face in a restaurant full of witnesses. This isn't something we're going to handle quietly." My phone had been buzzing constantly. James, switching between apologetic texts and thinly veiled threats. "You're overreacting. Come home so we can discuss this rationally. Think about what this will do to my reputation. Don't make me take legal action." Morgan took one look at the messages and confiscated my phone. "You don't need to see these right now," she said, her voice hard with anger. "But we're keeping them for evidence." Diane finished bandaging the worst of the burns and prescribed pain medication and antibiotics. "You're lucky," she said, though her expression suggested she used the word loosely. "A few degrees hotter or a few seconds longer, and these burns could have been much worse." As she wrote out the prescriptions, she also slipped me a card for a domestic violence support organization. "Just in case," she said quietly. "They have legal resources, counseling, everything you might need." The reality of my situation hit me then. I was sitting in an urgent care clinic at nearly midnight, burned and bandaged, officially becoming a domestic violence statistic. Tears started falling before I could stop them. "Hey," Lauren said, squeezing my hand. "You're not alone in this, and you're not going back there." "But where am I going to go?" I asked, the practical question hitting me suddenly. I couldn't go back to our condo. James would be there. Hotels would require credit cards that he could track. "My place," Morgan said firmly. "I have a guest. Room, security in the building, and I live alone. He doesn't know where I live." I started to protest, but Morgan cut me off. "Rebecca, how many times have you stayed late to help me finish a project? How many weekends have you given up to meet my deadlines? Let me help you now." Lauren and her friends insisted on accompanying us to Morgan's apartment, forming a protective convoy through the rainy streets. One of them, a former security guard turned nurse, checked Morgan's building entrance and hallways before letting us proceed to her unit. Morgan's guest room was small but cozy, decorated with some of the pillows and throws I'd helped her pick out for her apartment. The normalcy of those familiar designs, now in this completely abnormal situation, made me want to laugh and cry, simultaneously. "I'll call the pharmacy in the morning," Morgan said, setting up a makeshift first aid station on the bedside table. "For now, try to rest. I'm right in the next room if you need anything." Left alone, I sat on the edge of the bed, looking at my reflection in Morgan's decorative mirror. My face was blotchy from the burns, my makeup streaked with soup and rain, my hair a mess. But my eyes, they looked different, clearer somehow, as if the soup had washed away a film I hadn't known was there. My phone lay silent in Morgan's living room, but I knew what was happening across town. James would be pacing our condo, making calls, planning his next move. He wouldn't let me go easily. Controlling people never do. But as I touched the bandages on my neck, feeling the sting of the burns beneath, I made myself a promise. This was the last time James Harrison would ever hurt me. I just didn't know yet how hard he would fight to prove me wrong. I woke up the next morning to unfamiliar shadows on an unfamiliar ceiling, my skin feeling tight and painful where the burns had settled in overnight. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was. Then the smell of coffee and quiet voices drifted in from Morgan's kitchen, and everything came rushing back. The restaurant, the soup, the urgent care clinic. Gingerly, I made my way to Morgan's ensuite bathroom. The woman in the mirror looked like a stranger. Angry red patches marked my neck and upper chest. My normally styled hair was a tangled mess, and my eyes had the hollow look of someone who'd stepped through a door they couldn't return through. Morgan knocked softly, then entered with a cup of coffee and a bag from the pharmacy. "Michael Chen is here," she said, setting everything down on the vanity. "And Lauren dropped off some burn cream from the hospital. Special stuff they use in the burn unit. She said it works better than the over-the-counter options." I nodded, trying to process the fact that my lawyer had flown down from Vancouver and a nurse I'd met just hours ago was already going out of her way to help me. "What time is it?" "Just past 9. Morgan hesitated. "Rebecca, James has been calling the office all morning. He showed up at the studio an hour ago, demanding to know where you are. Kara at reception turned him away, but he's not taking no for an answer." My hand started shaking so badly I had to set the coffee cup down. "Did he seem angry?" "Yes, but controlled. Very controlled." Morgan's expression hardened. "He was wearing his white coat, talking about how concerned he is about your mental state and how you need medical attention. He's building a narrative." Of course he was. James never did. Anything without calculating all angles, planning his approach like he planned his surgeries. I could almost see him in my mind, standing in our condo last night, mapping out his strategy while I sat in an urgent care clinic having soup burns treated. Michael Chen was waiting in Morgan's living room, looking remarkably put together for someone who'd taken an early morning flight. 2 laptops were open on the coffee table, and papers were spread across Morgan's usually pristine sofa. "Rebecca?" he said, standing as I entered. His eyes took in the visible burns, and something fierce flashed across his usually calm face. "We need to talk about what happens next. Are you up for that?" I nodded, lowering myself carefully onto an armchair. The burns pulled uncomfortably with every movement. "First," Michael said, "we need to document everything. The urgent care clinic has already sent over their records. Thank you for signing that release form last night. The photos they took are compelling. But we need more. Morgan tells me there were witnesses at the restaurant?" "The entire dinner service," Morgan confirmed, "including Pierre LeBlanc, the owner. He's already provided a statement. He was quite clear about what he saw. Michael nodded, making notes. Good. Now, Rebecca, I need you to understand something. What happened last night wasn't just assault. It was a calculated act of domestic violence, likely triggered by your refusal to give James control of your inheritance. Given his subsequent behavior, we need to move quickly to protect both you and your assets. The word domestic violence hit me like a physical blow. In my mind, that term had always conjured images far removed from my life. Not successful, professional women with design firms and luxury condos, not wives of respected surgeons. James is already moving to control the narrative, Michael continued. He's contacted several members of the hospital board, suggesting you're having some kind of breakdown. He's trying to position himself as the concerned husband dealing with an unstable wife. Classic Darvo, came a new voice. I turned to see Lauren entering Morgan's apartment, still in her scrubs from what must have been a night shift. Deny? Attack? Reverse victim and offender. We see it all the time in the ER. I've already filed for an emergency protective order, Michael said. But we need to move fast on several fronts. Your grandmother's foresight in setting up the trust separately is proving invaluable. James can't touch those assets. But your joint accounts, the condo. He can keep the condo, I said, surprised by how little I cared about the space I'd spent years perfecting. I don't want anything from there except my personal items and business documents. Michael shook his head. It's not that simple. Washington is a community property state. Everything acquired during the marriage is subject to division. Plus, you contributed significantly to that property. We're not going to let him force you out of your rightful assets. The next hour was a blur of legal terms and strategic planning. Michael had already started divorce proceedings, citing domestic violence. He was moving to freeze joint accounts to prevent James from emptying them. Morgan was working on securing our client files and business accounts. Lauren provided additional documentation about my injuries and connected us with a domestic violence advocacy group. There's something else you need to see, Morgan said quietly, pulling out her tablet. He's already talking to the press. The local news website showed a photo of James outside the hospital, looking appropriately concerned in his white coat. The headline read, "Prominent surgeon seeks help for wife after public incident." The article quoted him discussing his concerns about my mental state following my grandmother's death and how the inheritance had triggered concerning behavior. "He's trying to gaslight you publicly," Lauren said, her voice tight with anger. "Make everyone doubt your version of events before you can even tell it." I stared at the image of James on the screen. This man I'd lived with for years, who'd shared my bed, my dreams, my life. How had I never seen the calculation behind his concern, the control masked as care? "What do we do?" I asked, looking at Michael. "We fight back," he said simply. "But we do it smart. James is used to being in control, to having his version of events accepted without question. He's not prepared for a victim who has support, documentation, and resources." "Speaking of resources," Morgan interjected, "the design community is already rallying. 3 clients called this morning after hearing James's version. They're willing to make statements about your mental stability and professional competence. And remember that domestic violence shelter renovation project you did last year?" their director called. "They want to help." I felt tears welling up, not from fear or pain this time, but from a surprising sense of strength. I wasn't alone. I wasn't powerless. And most importantly, I wasn't buying into James's narrative anymore. "Okay," I said, sitting up straighter despite the pain it caused. "Tell me what I need to do next." As Michael began outlining our strategy, I thought about Gran's letter, safely stored in my office. She'd known, maybe not the specifics, but she'd known I'd need help breaking free. Her gift wasn't just the inheritance. It was the means to escape, to fight back, to reclaim my life. James had thought throwing that soup would break me. Instead, it had burned away the last of my illusions, leaving behind something stronger than he'd bargained for. By the end of that first week after the soup incident, I learned exactly what James was capable of when his control was threatened. It started with the professional contacts, clients suddenly canceling meetings, citing concerns about my stability. Each cancellation came with nearly identical wording, making it clear who had scripted their responses. The first major blow came during a crucial presentation to a tech executive who wanted to renovate his entire Lake Washington estate. I was halfway through my proposal when he stopped me, looking uncomfortable. "I'm sorry, Ms. Shaw, but I've heard some concerning things. Dr. Harrison reached out to me personally. He's worried about your mental state affecting your ability to handle large projects right now." I sat there, my carefully prepared renderings spread across the conference table, feeling the ground shift beneath me. James knew exactly where to hit. My professional reputation, the thing I'd built from scratch. He'd found my client list, probably from accessing my laptop during those last weeks, and was methodically working his way through it. Morgan, sitting beside me, spoke up. "Mr. Chen, are you aware that Dr. Harrison is currently subject to a restraining order after assaulting Ms. Shaw in a public restaurant?" The client shifted uncomfortably. He mentioned there had been a misunderstanding. Said his wife was having difficulty processing her grandmother's death, becoming paranoid about their finances. A misunderstanding? Morgan pulled out her tablet. "Would you like to see the medical reports, the photographs, the witness?" Statements from an entire restaurant full of people who watched him throw scalding soup in her face? I touched Morgan's arm, stopping her. "It's okay," I said, beginning to pack up my presentations. "Mr. Chen, I understand your concerns, but I want you to think about something. You're planning to trust someone with designing your home, the place where your children will grow up, where you'll make memories with your family. Do you want to work with someone who can be professionally destroyed by a phone call? Or someone who stands up for themselves when faced with abuse?" The client's expression changed slightly. I hadn't thought about it that way. "Keep the proposal," I said, standing up. "Look at my portfolio, my track record. Then look up the public records of what happened at Le Petit Bistro. Make your decision based on facts, not someone else's narrative." As we left the meeting, Morgan was fuming. "We should expose him. Go to the media. Show everyone what he's doing." I shook my head. That's what he wants, to drag this into a public battle where it becomes he said, she said. We need to be smarter. Back at the studio, which we'd temporarily relocated to a secure office space recommended by Michael, more fires needed containing. James had apparently spent his morning calling our suppliers, questioning the studio's credit and suggesting they review their terms with us. 3 had already put our accounts on hold. "He's trying to cripple the business," Morgan said, staring at her computer screen. "Make you financially dependent so you'll have to come crawling back." "No," I corrected her, understanding dawning. "He's trying to prove I'm an unstable business owner who can't handle my grandmother's inheritance. This isn't just about me anymore. It's about the trust." My phone buzzed with a text from Michael Chen. "Emergency meeting needed. James's lawyer filed motion questioning your mental competency to manage the trust. Hearing scheduled for next week." I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, the one that used to precede giving in to James's demands. But this time, it was accompanied by something else. Anger. Clean, clarifying anger. "Morgan," I said, "call everyone in. Full team meeting." In 20 minutes. When my small but dedicated team assembled, I laid out the situation frankly. James is trying to destroy what we've built here. He thinks if he can make me look unstable and incompetent, he can gain control of my inheritance and, by extension, all of you. I looked at each of them. Morgan, my brilliant assistant who'd become so much more. Sophia, my lead designer who'd helped build our aesthetic from the ground up. Rachel, our project manager who could make impossible timelines work. And Alex, our newest hire who brought fresh energy to every project. I'll understand if any of you want to leave. This is going to get messy, and you didn't sign up for this. Fight. The silence that followed was broken by Alex's snort of derision. Leave? When we're about to show that bastard what we're really made of? Not a chance. Sophia nodded. My ex tried the same thing when I left him, called my family, my friends, tried to convince everyone I was crazy. You know what stopped him? Standing together, refusing to let him control the narrative. One. By one, they voiced their support, not just as employees but as allies in what was becoming a battle for everything I'd built. Okay then, I said, emotion making my voice rough. Let's show them exactly what a mentally unstable woman and her team can do. We worked late into the night, documenting every project, every decision, every success. We pulled testimonials from satisfied clients, photos of completed projects, financial records showing our growth. Rachel created a timeline of our business milestones alongside James's escalating controlling behavior, showing how the company had thrived despite, not because of, his influence. We need to be proactive, Sophia suggested. Instead of just defending against his accusations, we show what we're capable of. That sparked an idea. The Vancouver properties, I said slowly. Grant's trust wasn't just about preserving them. It was about growing them, making them better. Morgan caught on immediately. A showcase project. Something so impressive it makes any question of your competency look ridiculous. Working through the night, fueled by coffee and determination, we developed a comprehensive plan for renovating and revitalizing the entire historic block Grant had left me. Sustainable upgrades to the buildings, spaces for local artists, a community design center in the carriage house. Everything she would have loved. When Michael arrived the next morning to prep me for the competency hearing, he found not a woman crumbling under pressure, but a CEO surrounded by detailed plans, financial projections, and a team ready to back her play. He thought attacking your business would isolate you, Michael observed, looking over our work. Instead, he's given you a platform to demonstrate exactly why your grandmother trusted you with her legacy. Looking around at my team, my real family, I felt something I hadn't experienced since that night at Le Petit Bistrot. Certainty. James could try to burn my world down, but he'd forgotten something crucial. Like Grand's Victorian, I had good bones, a strong foundation. And I was done letting anyone make me doubt my own strength. The competency hearing was scheduled for Thursday morning at the King County Courthouse. I spent the days leading up to it, preparing with an intensity that surprised even me. The burns on my neck and chest were healing, leaving behind patches of tender pink skin that I covered with high-necked blouses, not to hide them, but to keep them from distracting from what really mattered. Your appearance is crucial, Michael advised during our prep session. James will expect you to look broken, unstable. We need you to project exactly the opposite. Lauren, who'd become an unexpected ally, brought in a friend who specialized in court appearances. Dress for success with a dash of old money, the stylist advised. Channel your grandmother's energy. You're not just fighting for yourself. You're protecting her legacy. We settled on a tailored navy suit that whispered old-school authority, paired with subtle pearl earrings that had been Grand's. My makeup was flawless but minimal, my hair styled in a way that suggested competence rather than fashion. Every detail was calculated to counter James's narrative of a woman falling apart. The morning of the hearing, I arrived early with my team. James was already there with his lawyer, Richard Stanford, both of them in expensive suits that suddenly seemed flashy compared to my understated elegance. I saw James do a double-take when he saw me. He'd expected dishevelment, signs of distress. Instead, he found himself facing a woman who looked more put together than she had in years. Ready? Michael asked quietly as we waited to be called. I nodded, watching James whisper urgently to his lawyer. You know what's interesting? He's so focused on trying to prove I'm unstable that he hasn't actually looked at what I've been doing with the business. Michael smiled. Sometimes the best defense is letting your opponent underestimate you. Inside the courtroom, Richard Stanford went on the attack immediately. He painted a picture of a woman unraveling after her grandmother's death, making erratic business decisions, becoming paranoid about her husband's intentions. He brought up the unfortunate incident at Le Petit Bistro, spinning it as evidence of my instability. Mrs. Harrison, he began. Ms. Shaw, I corrected firmly. I've resumed using my professional name. That small act of defiance seemed to throw him off slightly. Ms. Shaw, then, can you explain why you've been making major business decisions without consulting your husband? I can explain why I've been making business decisions without consulting someone who has no ownership stake or professional role in my company, I replied calmly. Would you like me to detail those decisions? That's when we unveiled our secret weapon, a comprehensive presentation of every business decision I'd made since Gran's death, complete with financial projections, market analyses, and support from industry experts. The Vancouver Revitalization Project took center stage, with architectural renderings, community impact studies, and letters of support from local officials. As you can see, Your Honor, Michael said, far from being erratic, Ms. Shaw has been methodically expanding her successful design firm while developing a visionary plan for the historic properties she inherited. Her grandmother's trust wasn't misplaced, it was prescient. James's face darkened as he watched his narrative crumble. When it was his turn to testify about my supposed instability, he tried to focus on the restaurant incident. My wife was becoming increasingly paranoid about finances, he said, his doctor's voice in full effect. When I tried to discuss reasonable investment opportunities for her inheritance, she became agitated. The soup was an unfortunate accident, during an emotional moment. An accident? Michael's voice was silk over steel. Dr. Harrison, we have 17 witnesses who saw you deliberately throw hot soup in your wife's face. We have medical records documenting second-degree burns. We have security footage from the restaurant. Would you like to revise your statement? The judge's expression spoke volumes. When James's lawyer tried to introduce testimony from concerned colleagues about my mental state, she cut him off. I've heard enough, she said. Not only do I find no evidence of mental incompetency, I'm deeply concerned about what appears to be a coordinated attempt to discredit Ms. Shaw and gain control of her inheritance through false allegations and professional sabotage. She turned to look directly at James. Dr. Harrison, I strongly suggest you cease these efforts immediately. This court finds Ms. Shaw not only competent, but exemplary in her business dealings and management of her inherited properties. Furthermore, I'm extending the existing restraining order and adding provisions specifically prohibiting any interference with Ms. Shaw's business operations. The victory felt surreal. As we left the courthouse, Morgan grabbed my hand. We did it? He can't touch the business now. But I was watching James talk intensely with his lawyer on the courthouse steps. No, I said quietly. This was just the first battle. He won't give up easily. Lauren, who'd taken the morning off to support me, nodded grimly. Men like him never do. But you've shown him something important today. What's that? That? You're not playing his game anymore. You're playing your own. Back at the studio, my team had arranged a small celebration. Someone had brought champagne, and Sophia had created a mock-up of the Vancouver project's first phase to display in our conference room. As I looked around at these people who'd stood by me, who'd helped me fight back when James tried to destroy everything I'd built, I felt something shift inside me. The fear wasn't gone. I knew James well enough to know this wasn't over, but it was no longer controlling me. Speech! Alex called out, raising their glass. I took a deep breath, looking at each face in turn. A week ago, James thought he could break me by attacking my business, my reputation, my sanity. He thought if he could prove me unstable, he could take everything, my inheritance, my company, my independence. I touched the healing burns on my neck, no longer hiding them. But he made a crucial mistake. He thought I was weak because I preferred peace to conflict. He thought I was unstable because I valued creativity and compassion over control. He thought he could destroy me because he never really saw me at all. Raising my glass, I smiled at my team. Here's to proving him wrong. And here's to all of you who reminded me that real strength isn't about control. It's about having the courage to create something beautiful, even when others try to tear it down. As we celebrated this small victory, I found myself thinking about Gran's Victorian mansion waiting in Vancouver. James had tried to paint my plans for it as evidence of instability. Instead, they'd become proof of my vision, my competence, my right to control my own destiny. The burns would heal, the business would recover, and I would keep building, keep creating, keep growing stronger. Because that's what my grandmother had taught me, what James had never understood. True power isn't in tearing things down, but in building them up. James's retaliation for the competency hearing came swiftly and from an unexpected direction. I was in Vancouver, meeting with city officials about the historic district renovation plans, when Morgan called in a panic. The hospital board is filing a formal ethics complaint against you, she said, her voice tight with anger. They're claiming you're making false allegations against a respected surgeon that are damaging the hospital's reputation. James presented them with edited security footage from Le Petit Bistro that makes it look like you threw the soup at yourself during an emotional outburst. I gripped my phone tighter, glad I was alone in my hotel room. That's impossible. We have the original footage, witnesses. Of course we do. But he's playing a different game now. The complaint triggers an automatic investigation. They're saying your false claims could impact patient trust, hospital funding, even the pediatric surgery program. The calculation of it took my breath away. James knew exactly how to twist this. Make it not about him, but about sick children who might suffer if their star surgeon's reputation was damaged. He was using his position, his reputation, and most cruelly, his young patients as shields. There's more, Morgan continued. 3 of our biggest commercial clients received letters from the hospital board expressing grave concerns about working with someone who would fabricate domestic violence allegations for financial gain. 2 have already pulled their contracts. I sat down heavily on the hotel bed, my mind racing. This wasn't just about the inheritance anymore. James was trying to destroy everything I'd built, make me so toxic professionally that I'd have no choice but to give in. My phone buzzed with another call, Michael Chen. Hold on, Morgan. I switched lines. Michael? I just got out of an emergency meeting with the Vancouver Historical Society, he said without preamble. Someone sent them an anonymous tip suggesting you're planning to demolish the historic buildings and build modern condos. They're considering legal action to block any renovations. Of course, James couldn't attack the trust directly anymore, so he was going after the properties themselves. I could almost admire the strategic thinking if it wasn't so devastating. That's not all, Michael continued. The tip came with financial documents suggesting you're in severe debt and planning to flip the properties for quick cash. The documents look legitimate. Account numbers, transaction histories. He had access to all our financial records. Before I left, I realized, he's been planning this since the beginning. I spent the next hour on a conference call with Michael, Morgan, and our newly hired PR consultant, Sarah Martinez. James had orchestrated a perfect storm, attacking my professional reputation, my business relationships, and my ability to manage Gran's properties all at once. He's trying to force you to fight on multiple fronts, Sarah observed. Spread your resources thin, make you look defensive and unstable. The hospital board complaint is the masterstroke, Michael added. It puts you in an impossible position. Fight back too hard. You're attacking a children's hospital. Don't fight hard enough. You look guilty. I stood up and walked to the hotel window, looking out at the Vancouver skyline. The Victorian mansion was visible from here, its distinctive roofline standing proud against modern glass towers. Gran had protected it for decades, refusing countless lucrative offers from developers. Now I understood why. It wasn't just about the building, but about standing your ground when easier options presented themselves. Okay, I said, turning back to the phone. Here's what we're going to do. Morgan, contact Pierre at Le Petit Bistro. It's time he spoke publicly about what he saw. His restaurant's reputation is being damaged by James's edited footage. He has every right to set the record straight. On it, Morgan replied. And the hospital board? Sarah, draft? A response that focuses solely on the facts. No emotions, no accusations. Just the original security footage, witness statements, and medical records. Add a statement supporting the hospital's mission and expressing concern that false narratives could damage patient trust. Turn it back on them, Sarah said approvingly. Smart. Michael, for the Historical Society. We don't just deny the demolition rumors. We show them our full renovation plans. In fact, let's schedule a public presentation. Invite local media, preservation groups, everyone. Make it impossible for James to spread more lies about our intentions. What about the commercial clients? Morgan asked. I thought about it for a moment. Send them the same evidence package we're sending the hospital board, but add something else. The Vancouver project plans. Show them what we're really about. Some will still walk away, but others might see an opportunity to be part of something bigger. As my team sprang into action, I received a text from James. Ready to be reasonable yet? This can all go away if you just sign over the trust. Looking at his message, I felt something unexpected, pity. He still thought this was about money, about control. He couldn't understand that every attack was just making me stronger, more determined. I typed back a single response. Thank you. His reply came quickly. For what? For showing me exactly who you are. I needed that clarity. Then I blocked his number and called Lauren. She answered immediately, despite the late hour. Everything okay? Remember when you said I wasn't playing his game anymore? You were right, but I think it's time we change the rules completely. What do you mean? I looked again at the Victorian mansion, thinking about Gran's letter, about her journey, about every woman who'd ever had to fight to maintain her independence. James thinks he can isolate me by attacking my reputation. But what if we use that attention to tell a different story? Not just about me, but about all the women who've faced what I'm facing. Lauren was quiet for a moment. You want to go public? That's risky. No, I corrected her. I want to go bigger. The Vancouver project isn't just about renovating buildings anymore. It's going to be a center for women rebuilding their lives after domestic violence. Art spaces, business incubators, support services, everything I wished I'd had access to these past weeks. He'll fight it, Lauren warned. I touched the nearly healed burns on my neck. Let him. Every attack just proves why we need it more. As I hung up, I felt a strange sense of peace. James thought he was destroying my world. Instead, he was helping me build something he could never understand, a foundation for change that would long outlast our battle. The war wasn't over. But for the first time, I wasn't just fighting against something. I was fighting for something bigger than myself. And that made all the difference. The Vancouver project announcement hit the local media like a lightning bolt. Historic mansion to become haven for survivors, read the headline in the Vancouver Sun. Within hours, other outlets picked up the story. drawn to the irony of a domestic violence survivor using her abuser's attempts to control her inheritance to create a space for other survivors. I was in the middle of a planning meeting with my team when the first unexpected ally arrived. Dr. Catherine Walsh, Chief of Emergency Medicine at James's own hospital, walked into our temporary office space unannounced. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, her presence commanding attention, "but we need to talk about James Harrison." My team tensed, but I recognized something in her expression, a combination of determination and carefully controlled anger I'd become familiar with. "Recently, for 3 years," she continued, "I've been trying to establish a comprehensive support program for domestic violence victims in our ER. You know what the biggest obstacle has been? Your husband and his allies on the hospital board. They think it would damage the hospital's image to acknowledge domestic violence in our community." She placed a thick folder on the conference table. "These are incident reports from the ER, redacted for privacy, but they show a pattern. Wealthy women coming in with suspicious injuries, refusing to press charges because their husbands are respected members of the community. These sound familiar?" I thought about all the hospital fundraisers I'd attended, smiling through my migraines while James charmed the donors. How many other women had been there, hiding similar stories behind perfect makeup and designer dresses? "What are you proposing?" I asked. "A partnership. Your Vancouver Center on one side of the border, our hospital program on the other. We create a comprehensive support network that doesn't stop at the boundary line, and we use your story to break the silence about domestic violence in the medical community." It was exactly the kind of alliance James wouldn't expect, a respected colleague turning his own hospital's resources against him. That meeting opened the floodgates. By the end of the week, our office had become a hub of unexpected connections. Social workers, legal advocates, real estate developers interested in social impact projects, artists wanting to contribute to the space, each person brought their own piece to the growing puzzle. But the most surprising ally came from within, James's own family. His sister-in-law, Rebecca, arrived one afternoon, looking nervous but determined. "James doesn't know I'm here," she said quickly, "but I can't stay silent anymore. 2 years ago, when my brother, James's brother, started showing the same controlling behaviors with me, James helped cover it up, said it would damage the family reputation if I spoke out. He arranged for my therapy sessions, chose the therapist, made sure everything stayed quiet." Her hands shook as she pulled out her phone. "I kept everything. Texts, emails, recordings of conversations. I thought someday I might need them. When I saw what he did to you at Le Petit Bistro, what he's trying to do now, I knew it was time." The evidence she provided was damning, not just about her own situation, but about James's pattern of helping other men in his social circle hide their abusive behavior. It revealed a network of power and privilege that went far beyond our personal battle. Morgan, who'd been quietly taking notes, spoke up. "This changes everything. It's not just about the Vancouver project anymore. We're exposing a whole system." She was right. Each new ally brought not just support, but a piece of a larger picture. Dr. Walsh's ER reports, Rebecca's documentation, and our own experiences formed a pattern that couldn't be ignored. Lauren, who'd become an integral part of our team, helped us organize the information. "We need to be strategic about this," she advised. "James isn't just one abuser, he's part of a structure that protects abusers in positions of power." We set up a secure database to collect and organize evidence, stories, and resources. Women began reaching out through encrypted channels, sharing their own experiences with James and men like him. Hospital staff, social workers, even other doctors' wives, each had a piece of the puzzle. The Vancouver project evolved accordingly. Beyond just providing services, it would become a research and advocacy center, documenting patterns of abuse in privileged communities and developing strategies to combat them. "Your grandmother would be proud," Michael said during one of our planning sessions. She didn't just leave you property. She gave you a platform to create real change. But with increased support came increased risk. James and his allies realized what was happening and intensified their efforts to discredit me. Anonymous threats arrived. Suspicious cars parked outside our office. Our security system detected multiple attempts to hack our databases. They're scared, Sarah observed. Men like James rely on silence and isolation. A network of survivors supporting each other? That's their worst nightmare. We increased security, both physical and digital. Lauren's hospital connections helped us implement protocols to protect our allies. Every threat, every attempt at intimidation was documented and added to our growing body of evidence. One evening, as I was reviewing plans for the Vancouver Center, I found a photo of Gran in her garden. She was standing proud among her roses, her face set in that determined expression I remembered so well. "You knew, didn't you?" I whispered to her image. "You knew I'd need more than just financial independence. I'd need a purpose bigger than myself." The photo seemed to smile back at me. Gran had always said that true strength comes not from standing alone, but from helping others stand with you. Every person who joined our cause, every story shared, every resource offered was proving her right. James had thrown that soup thinking it would silence me. Instead, it had become the catalyst for a movement that would help countless others find their voice. The burns had healed, but their impact continued to spread, creating ripples of change that would be felt long after our personal battle was over. That night, I added a new element to the Vancouver project plans: a garden filled with Gran's favorite roses. A place of beauty and resilience where survivors could find the strength to grow through their own storms. Because sometimes the best way to heal is to create something beautiful from the ashes of what tried to destroy you. The annual Seattle Medical Association Gala was the last place I expected to face James again. I'd planned to skip the event entirely, but Dr. Walsh insisted my presence was crucial. "He's been using these gatherings to control the narrative," she explained. Time to change that. I chose my outfit carefully, a deep emerald silk gown that made me look both powerful and approachable. The neckline was high enough to cover the remaining burn marks, not to hide them, but to keep them from becoming the focus. Gran's pearls completed the look, along with the quiet confidence I'd built over the past months. Lauren and Dr. Walsh flanked me as we entered the grand ballroom of the Four Seasons. The whispers started immediately. Surgeons and their wives who'd known us as the perfect couple, board members who'd received James's carefully crafted versions of events, donors who'd been told about my supposed instability. I felt James's presence before I saw him. He was holding court near the stage, surrounded by his usual circle of admirers. The sight of him in his tuxedo, gesturing animatedly as he told some surely carefully crafted story, made my stomach clench. But it wasn't fear this time. It was recognition. I could see through his performance now, the calculated charm, the precise way he positioned himself as the center of attention. "Ready?" Dr. Walsh murmured. I nodded. We'd planned this carefully. James had used these social gatherings as weapons against me. Time to turn that strategy on its head. We made our way through the crowd, stopping to speak with key figures we'd identified. With each conversation, we planted seeds, subtle mentions of the Vancouver Project, questions about the hospital's domestic violence protocols, discussions about the importance of believing women who report abuse. I could feel James watching, see him trying to maintain his composure while his carefully constructed narrative began to unravel. The breaking point came during the dinner service. "Ms. Shaw?" called out Dr. Patricia Chen, a prominent neurosurgeon, from 2 tables over. "I've been reading about your Vancouver project. The integration of support services with artistic spaces is brilliant. Would you tell us more about it?" The request was genuine, but the timing was perfect. Just as James was about to give his usual speech about the pediatric surgery wing's achievements, all eyes turned to me. I stood, smoothing my dress with steady hands. "The Vancouver Center for Renewal," I began, my voice clear and confident, "grew from a simple truth. Healing requires more than just medical care. It requires a space where people can rebuild their lives, their confidence, their sense of self." As I spoke about the project, I could see James's face darkening. He knew what was coming, but was powerless to stop it without causing a scene. "The center will partner with medical facilities on both sides of the border," I continued, nodding to Dr. Walsh. "Because we've learned that domestic violence doesn't respect boundaries, geographical or social. It can happen to anyone, anywhere, even in the most supposedly respectable circles." The tension in the room was palpable. Everyone knew what I was referencing, but no one had dared speak about it in this setting before. "In fact," I added, "the inspiration for the center came from my own experience. Sometimes it takes a bowl of French onion soup in the face to wake you up to reality." The shocked gasps around the room were audible. James stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Rebecca," he said, his voice tight with controlled rage, "you're embarrassing yourself." "No, James," I replied calmly. "I'm just finally telling the truth. Would you like to share your version of events? Perhaps explain to everyone how that soup accidentally flew across the table at Le Petit Bistrot?" He started toward me, but Dr. Walsh and several others moved to block his path. The mask slipped then, just for a moment, but long enough for everyone to see the rage beneath his carefully maintained facade. "This is ridiculous," he sputtered. "She's clearly unstable. The stress of her grandmother's death. Has the hospital board reviewed the unedited security footage yet?" I interrupted. "Or just the convenient version you provided? Pierre LeBlanc would be happy to share the original. He's quite concerned about the false narrative you've been spreading about his restaurant." James's face flushed red. "You're destroying everything we built." "No, James. I'm building something new. Something real. And I'm not alone anymore." As if on cue, Dr. Walsh stepped forward. "The hospital board will be receiving a detailed proposal tomorrow for comprehensive domestic violence protocols, along with documentation of cases where intervention was discouraged to protect certain individuals' reputations." Others began to stand. Doctors, nurses, administrators I'd worked with through Lauren and Dr. Walsh. Each had their own story, their own evidence of how James and his allies had worked to silence victims and protect abusers. James looked around the room, realizing he was losing control of his carefully cultivated world. His hand twitched, and for a moment, I thought he might grab the nearest wine glass and repeat history. But even he knew he couldn't explain away. Another public assault. "This isn't over," he said quietly, menace dripping from every word. "You're right," I agreed. "It's just beginning, but not in the way you think." As he stormed out of the ballroom, the whispers started again. But different this time. People were sharing their own stories, making connections, realizing they weren't alone. The wall of silence that had protected men like James for so long was beginning to crumble. Dr. Chen approached me, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "My sister," she said softly. 3 years ago, we all kept quiet because her husband was a respected surgeon. Maybe if we'd spoken up then." "We're speaking up now," I told her, squeezing her hand, "and we're building something that will help others speak up too." Looking around the ballroom, I saw something James never could. The power of truth to break through carefully constructed facades, the strength that comes from standing together, the healing that begins when silence ends. The burns on my neck seemed to tingle, remembering that night at Le Petit Bistrot. James had meant that soup to be a weapon of control. Instead, it had become a catalyst for change, its heat burning away not just my illusions about my marriage, but the collective illusions that had protected abusers in our community for too long. The battle wasn't over. Men like James don't give up easily. But standing there in Grand's Pearls, surrounded by allies old and new, I knew we'd won something significant. We'd broken the silence, and once broken, silence can never be fully restored. The morning after the gala, Seattle woke up to headlines. Prominent surgeon accused of domestic violence at medical gala, and Vancouver Center founder exposes culture of abuse in medical community. My phone wouldn't stop buzzing with notifications. Calls and messages, some supportive, others decidedly not. I was in Michael's office reviewing security footage from the gala when the first wave of retaliation hit. James had moved faster than we anticipated, filing a defamation lawsuit not just against me, but against Dr. Walsh, the Vancouver Center Project, and every board member who had sided with us. He's trying to bury us in legal fees, Michael observed, scanning the lawsuit documents. The allegations are thin, but defending against them will be expensive and time-consuming. He's counting on that to drain our resources. There's more, Morgan interrupted, rushing in with her tablet. Someone leaked private patient information from my medical records to several medical blogs. Old therapy sessions, anxiety medication, prescriptions, all carefully selected to support James's claims about my mental state. The violation felt intimate, another boundary crossed. But James had miscalculated, again. He accessed private medical records? Dr. Walsh's voice was sharp through the speakerphone. That's not just unethical, it's illegal. I'm calling an emergency board meeting. This goes beyond professional misconduct. By noon, 3 more lawsuits had arrived, these from James's closest allies on the hospital board. Each claimed damages to their reputation, each demanded massive compensation, and each was clearly designed to overwhelm us with legal complications. They're trying to drown us, Sarah Martinez noted during our emergency strategy meeting, make us look defensive, desperate. But something unexpected was happening alongside the legal onslaught. My inbox was filling with messages from other doctors' wives, hospital staff, and medical professionals across the country. Each had their own story of abuse covered up, of silence enforced, of careers threatened. Look at this, Lauren said, pulling up an email. Dr. Elizabeth Warner from Boston General. She's offering to testify about similar cases she's documented. Says she's been building a database of domestic violence in medical communities for years, but couldn't find anyone willing to go public. The Vancouver Center's secure server was being flooded with submissions, documents, emails, recordings. Women who'd been silenced were finding their voices, and they had receipts. They thought isolating us would shut this down, Morgan observed. Instead, they're creating exactly the kind of documentation we need to prove this is systemic. But James wasn't done. That evening, as I was leaving the office, a sleek black car pulled up alongside me. The window rolled down to reveal Richard Stanford, James's lawyer. "Get in," he said. "We need to talk." "Anything you have to say can go through Michael," I replied, continuing to walk. "He's offering a deal," Stanford called after me. "Full ownership of the condo, a generous settlement, all legal actions dropped. He'll even make a public statement supporting your business. All you have to do is sign over control of the Vancouver properties and agree to a non-disclosure agreement." I stopped walking. The offer was clever, seemingly generous while actually accomplishing everything James wanted. Control of the properties that could expose his network, my silence guaranteed by legal agreement. "Tell James," I said without turning around, "that he still doesn't understand what this is about. This was never about property or money." "Don't be naive," Stanford snapped, his professional demeanor cracking slightly. "You're going up against some of the most powerful men in the medical community. They can make sure you never work in this city again." "Probably," I agreed, finally turning to face him. "But they can't stop what's already happening. Every threat, every lawsuit, Every attempted intimidation just proves why we need the Vancouver Center more. As if to prove my point, my phone buzzed with a news alert. Medical Board launches investigation into patient privacy violations at Seattle General. Dr. Walsh had moved faster than expected. The next morning brought more developments. Dr. Patricia Chen, inspired by the gala confrontation, had gone public with her sister's story. 3 other board members had come forward with similar accounts. James's careful network was unraveling as more people found the courage to speak. But the real blow to James's campaign came from an unexpected source. Pierre LeBlanc, owner of Le Petit Bistrot, called a press conference on his restaurant's steps. "I have remained silent too long," he announced in his thick French accent. "What happened in my restaurant was not an accident, not a misunderstanding. It was assault, calculated and cruel. And my silence has made me complicit." He proceeded to play the unedited security footage on a large screen for all assembled media to see. The images were crystal clear. James's deliberate actions, the calculated way he'd thrown the soup, his calm demeanor afterward. No creative editing could explain this away. "My restaurant has always been a place of celebration, of love," Pierre continued. "To have it used as a setting for abuse. This, I cannot accept. So today, I announce that Le Petit Bistrot will partner with the Vancouver Center, providing culinary training programs for survivors rebuilding their lives." James's response was swift and ruthless. Within hours, his allies had launched a campaign to boycott the restaurant, flooding review sites with false complaints, even making veiled threats about health inspections. But for every attack, support grew stronger. Other restaurants joined Pierre's initiative. More medical professionals came forward. The wall of silence that had protected abusers for so long was crumbling, one story at a time. That evening, sitting in my temporary office surrounded by evidence of both the attacks and the growing support, I found myself looking at Gran's photo again. "The thing about roses," she used to say, "is that they grow stronger when pruned. Each cut, each challenge, just makes them more determined to bloom." I touched the fading burn scars on my neck, thinking about how each of James's attempts to destroy me had only made our cause stronger. He'd thrown that soup thinking it would silence me. Instead, it had become the first drop in a wave of truth that was washing away years of enforced silence. The lawsuits would continue, the threats wouldn't stop. But something fundamental had shifted. We weren't just fighting one man's abuse anymore. We were challenging an entire system that protected abusers. And with each new voice that joined ours, that system's foundations weakened a little more. The Vancouver Historical Society meeting was packed, every seat filled with preservationists, community members, and media representatives. I stood at the podium, facing the crowd that would either become our strongest allies or our biggest obstacles. Some of you received anonymous tips suggesting I plan to demolish these historic buildings. I began, my voice steady. Others heard rumors about financial troubles and hasty development plans. Today, I'm going to show you the truth, not just about the buildings, but about why preserving them matters more than anyone realized. The presentation we'd prepared was comprehensive. First, the architectural plans, showing how we'd preserve every historic detail while updating the buildings for their new purpose. Then, the financial documentation, transparent, detailed, proving the project's sustainability. But it was the last part that changed everything. These buildings, I continued, have always been more than just structures. They've been sanctuaries. My grandmother understood that. During her lifetime, she quietly helped dozens of women escape abusive situations, providing them temporary shelter in these very buildings. A murmur went through the crowd. I clicked to the next slide, showing an old photograph of Gran standing with a group of women in front of the Victorian mansion. What you're looking at is from 1985. Every woman in this photo was escaping domestic violence. My grandmother gave them not just shelter, but a chance to rebuild their lives. The Vancouver Center isn't a new idea. It's continuing a legacy that's been part of these buildings' history for decades. The revelation transformed the atmosphere in the room. Preservation wasn't just about maintaining architecture anymore. It was about protecting a secret history of sanctuary and survival. Dr. Walsh stepped forward then, presenting our comprehensive plan for integrating medical support services. Lauren followed with data on current needs in the community. Morgan showcased the Business Incubator program designed to help survivors achieve financial independence. By the end of the presentation, the Historical Society wasn't just convinced. They were passionate advocates. The president herself stood up and announced their full support, along with a grant for historical documentation of the building's role in supporting domestic violence survivors. But our victory at the Historical Society meeting triggered another round of escalation from James. This time, he targeted our construction permits, using his connections to raise endless bureaucratic obstacles. He's filed 17 different environmental impact challenges, Michael reported during our emergency strategy session. Each one requires separate reviews, studies, responses. Time and money, I finished. He's trying to drain our resources before we can even break ground. That's when Sarah Martinez, our PR consultant, had an inspiration. What if we turn this delay into an advantage? Use the time to launch a documentary project about the building's history. The idea took root. We began collecting stories from women Gran had helped, documenting the secret history of sanctuary she'd created. Each woman's story reinforced why the Vancouver Center was so necessary, why these buildings needed to be preserved and repurposed rather than replaced with modern development. James's attempts to delay construction through bureaucratic means backfired spectacularly. Every challenge he filed gave us more time to build public support, gather more stories, strengthen our network. The project was becoming bigger than any of us had imagined. But James had one more card to play. On a rainy Tuesday morning, I arrived at the office to find Morgan waiting with troubling news. "Someone's been going through Gran's old financial records," she said, her face tight with concern. "They're trying to prove she obtained the properties through fraudulent means." The accusation was cleverly crafted. If they could cast doubt on Gran's original ownership of the buildings, they could potentially void the entire inheritance. I sat at my desk, looking at the photo of Gran in her garden, thinking about all she'd built, all she'd protected. Then I noticed something in the background of the photo, a small notebook in her hand, the kind she always carried. "Morgan," I said slowly, "help me go through Gran's papers. All of them. Every receipt, every diary, every notebook." For the next 3 days, we immersed ourselves in decades of documentation. Gran had kept everything: property deeds, tax records, business correspondence. But more importantly, she'd kept detailed journals documenting every woman she'd helped, every life she'd touched. "Look at this," Morgan said late on the third night, holding up a leather-bound ledger from 1972. "She didn't just buy these buildings, she saved them. The original owner was going to sell to developers, but Gran organized the local business community to preserve the historic district. She didn't just acquire property, she protected a community's heritage." The ledger contained letters of support from business owners, community leaders, even the mayor at the time. Every transaction was meticulously documented, every decision supported by community input. This isn't just evidence of legal ownership, I realized. It's proof that these buildings have always been meant for community service. Gran didn't just own them, she was their steward. We compiled everything into a comprehensive document, 50 years of history showing how Gran had legally and ethically acquired the properties, then used them to serve the community. The paperwork was bulletproof, but the stories were what made it powerful. When James's lawyers filed their challenge to Gran's ownership, we were ready. Michael presented not just legal documentation, but testimonials from dozens of community members about the building's historical role as a sanctuary. The attempt to invalidate Gran's ownership became instead a public celebration of her legacy. The victory was decisive, but it gave me something else too, a deeper understanding of what Gran had built and what she'd been preparing me to continue. She hadn't just left me property, she'd left me a mission. That evening, as I stood in the garden of the Victorian mansion watching the sunset, I felt Gran's presence stronger than ever. The roses she'd planted still bloomed, hardy and beautiful, despite years of neglect. Like the women she'd helped, like the legacy she'd built, like the granddaughter she'd prepared for this moment. Sometimes the most delicate-looking things proved to be the strongest. James had thought he could erase Gran's legacy by attacking its legal foundation. Instead, he'd helped us uncover and strengthen it. Every challenge he presented just revealed more of the foundation she'd built, stone by stone, story by story, life by life. The Vancouver Centre would be more than just a refuge now. It would be a continuation of a legacy 50 years in the making, a testament to the power of one woman's vision to change countless lives. And no amount of legal challenges could erase that history. The construction permits for the Vancouver Centre finally came through on a crisp autumn morning, almost exactly 1 year after the night James threw that soup in my face. I stood on the mansion's front steps, watching the sunrise paint the sky, in shades of pink and gold that would have inspired a dozen design schemes in my old life. My phone buzzed with a message from Morgan. "Turn on the news, Channel 4. I pulled up the live stream on my phone to see James standing outside the hospital, looking perfectly composed in his surgical scrubs. The caption read, "Renowned surgeon addresses controversy." "While I regret the personal matters that have become public," he was saying, his doctor voice in full effect, "I want to focus on what's important, the children who need our care. That's why I'm announcing a new initiative for the pediatric surgery ward." The announcement that followed was Calculated Brilliance, a program providing surgery for underprivileged children, funded by anonymous donors, undoubtedly his allies on the hospital board. He was trying to rewrite the narrative again, positioning himself as the dedicated healer while painting me as the vindictive ex-wife distracting from real issues. A year ago, this would have shaken me. Now, I found myself studying his performance, with professional detachment, noting the careful way he'd positioned himself with the children's ward visible in the background. How he'd chosen the early morning light to soften his features. "He's good," Lauren commented, joining me on the steps. She'd driven up from Seattle for the permit approval. "But he's playing yesterday's game." She was right. While James was still fighting the old battle, trying to control public perception, through carefully staged appearances, we'd moved on to something bigger. The Vancouver Centre had evolved far beyond its original concept. What started as a refuge was becoming a revolution in how communities address domestic violence. The design studio in the carriage house wasn't just teaching survivors practical skills, it was helping them reclaim their creative voice. The business incubator program had already launched 3 successful startups. The medical partnership with Dr. Walsh had expanded to include 5 hospitals across the Pacific Northwest. My own design firm had transformed too. We still did high-end residential projects, but now we also specialized in trauma-informed design, creating spaces that promoted healing and empowerment. The waiting list for our services grew longer every week. "Ms. Shaw?" A voice interrupted my thoughts. A young woman stood at the bottom of the steps, looking nervous but determined. "I'm Amy. I was hoping. Could we talk?" I recognized her from the hospital gala photos. She'd been standing in the background, watching everything unfold. James's new surgical resident. Over coffee and what would soon become the center's community cafe, Amy shared her story. The subtle undermining of her confidence, the mentoring sessions that left her doubting herself, the gradual isolation from her peers. It was James's pattern, repeating itself with a new target. "I thought I was losing my mind," she said, twisting her coffee cup. "Then I saw you at the gala, the way you stood up to him. I realized I wasn't crazy. I wasn't alone." "You never were," I told her, sharing our secure contact database where other survivors shared their stories and resources. "And you won't be the last one he tries to control. But you might be the last one he succeeds with." That afternoon, during the project team meeting, I shared Amy's story. "We need to expand the program," I said. "It's not just about physical abuse. The pattern starts long before that, with professional abuse, emotional manipulation, isolation." Morgan was already taking notes. "We could develop workshops specifically for medical residents and students. Warning signs, support networks, professional resources. Partner with medical schools," Lauren added. "Make it part of their training." The ideas flowed rapidly. Each team member brought their own expertise, their own perspective on how to break the cycle of abuse before it escalated to violence. I looked around the room, at Morgan, who'd grown from assistant to full partner, at Sophia, whose designs now incorporated healing principles she'd learned from working with survivors, at Rachel, who'd developed our trauma-informed project management approach. We'd all evolved, all grown stronger through this fight. Later, reviewing the latest designs for the center's interior, I found myself adding elements that would have been impossible in my old life. Spaces that honored both strength and vulnerability. Colors that spoke of renewal rather than mere aesthetics. Details that told stories of survival and growth. My phone buzzed again. Another news alert about James's children's surgery initiative. The comments section was filled with praise for his dedication, his generosity, his healing touch. A year ago, that would have felt like defeat. Now, I understood something James never could. True power isn't in controlling the narrative, but in changing it completely. While he was playing to the cameras, we were transforming lives. While he was defending his reputation, we were building a movement. I touched the scars on my neck, almost completely faded now. Like the Victorian mansion we were renovating. Some marks remain visible, not as wounds, but as reminders of transformation. Each scar, each challenge, each attempt to silence us had only made our foundation stronger. That evening, as the construction crews began setting up their equipment, I walked through the mansion's rooms one last time in their original state. Each space held stories, grand secret histories of helping survivors, my own journey from victim to advocate, and soon, countless new stories of healing and renewal. In the garden, Gran's roses still bloomed, hardy and beautiful against the autumn chill. I thought about how she'd planned this, planting seeds both literal and metaphorical that would bloom long after she was gone. Like her roses, her legacy hadn't just survived, it had thrived, growing into something more beautiful and powerful than even she might have imagined. James's soup had been meant to scald me into submission. Instead, it had burned away the last of my illusions, revealing a strength I hadn't known I possessed. Now that strength was helping others find their own power, their own voice, their own way forward. The transformation wasn't just in the building or the program. It was in every person touched by this journey, including me. We weren't just surviving anymore. We were reimagining what healing could look like, what strength could mean, what change could accomplish. And we were just getting started. The first warning came from an unexpected source. Richard Stanford, James's lawyer, requested a private meeting at his downtown Seattle office. Against Michael's advice, I agreed to meet him, curious about what would make James's staunchest ally reach out directly. Stanford looked tired, his usual polished appearance slightly frayed around the edges. "This isn't an official meeting," he said, closing his office door. "Consider it a professional courtesy." He pulled out a thick folder. "James is planning something. I don't know exactly what, but he's been meeting with people I wouldn't want anywhere near my practice. The kind of folks who specialize in making problems disappear. Why are you telling me this? I asked, studying his face for any sign of deception. Stanford sighed, suddenly looking older. Because my daughter just started her medical residency, and yesterday she came home crying about how her attending physician, a close friend of James's, made her feel worthless in front of the entire team. When she described his behavior, I recognized the pattern. The revelation hit hard. Even James's closest allies were beginning to see the web of control and manipulation he'd woven through the medical community. I can't officially help you, Stanford continued, but I can tell you to watch your back, and maybe, he hesitated, maybe keep doing what you're doing with the Vancouver Center. Some things need to change. Back at our temporary office, I shared Stanford's warning with the team. Morgan immediately strengthened our security protocols. Lauren coordinated with hospital security to protect our medical partners. Sophia began redesigning our workspace with additional safety measures. He's getting desperate, Dr. Walsh observed during our emergency conference call. The hospital board is launching a full investigation into patterns of abuse and harassment in the residency program. His power base is eroding. But James's desperation made him more dangerous, not less. Over the next week, small incidents began accumulating. The construction company received anonymous complaints about safety violations. Building inspectors showed up unannounced, citing anonymous tips. Suppliers suddenly backed out of contracts. Then came the personal attacks. Someone had been following me, taking photos, at coffee shops, leaving meetings, visiting construction sites. The photos appeared on a newly created blog, accompanied by wild speculations about my mental state and business dealings. Classic intimidation tactics, Sarah Martinez said, reviewing the blog. But look at the comments. People aren't buying it anymore. The narrative has shifted. She was right. For every accusatory post, dozens of supporters shared their own stories of survival and recovery. The blog meant to destroy my reputation was instead becoming a forum for the very conversations we were trying to start. The real challenge came when James attempted to turn our own network against us. He began reaching out to domestic violence survivors we'd helped, offering financial support in exchange for public statements discrediting the Vancouver Center. Linda, one of our first residents, brought us the evidence, recorded conversations, written offers, detailed scripts she was supposed to follow. He said he could help get my kids into better schools, she explained, hands shaking as she played the recordings. Said all I had to do was tell people the center was mismanaging funds, that you were using our stories for publicity. Instead of breaking us, these attempts at sabotage strengthened our community. Women began documenting every contact, every offer, every attempt at manipulation. Each piece of evidence became part of our growing documentation of systemic abuse. He still thinks this is about control, Morgan observed as we added Linda's recordings to our secure database. He doesn't understand we're past that now. She was right. While James focused on traditional power plays, money, intimidation, manipulation, we were building something he couldn't comprehend, a community based on mutual support and empowerment. The Vancouver Center construction continued despite the obstacles. Each attempt to delay or discredit the project only brought more attention to our cause. Local businesses, initially hesitant to be associated with domestic violence services, began reaching out to offer support. It's like watching dominoes fall in reverse, Rachel said during our weekly project meeting. Every time he pushes one down, 10 more stand up. The turning point came when James tried to use the medical community's peer review process against Dr. Walsh. He engineered a series of complaints about her emergency room protocols, specifically targeting her domestic violence screening procedures. But the medical community had evolved. Instead of the silent compliance he expected, James found himself facing a united front of healthcare providers tired of enabling abuse. Dr. Patricia Chen led the charge, organizing a coalition of medical professionals committed to addressing domestic violence in their community. The peer review became a platform for exposing the systemic problems we'd been fighting. "Your husband's actions," Dr. Chen told me during a strategy session, "have inadvertently created exactly what we needed, a crisis big enough to force institutional change." One evening, reviewing security footage from our construction site, I caught a glimpse of James watching from his car across the street. He sat there for hours, observing the progress he couldn't stop, the changes he couldn't control. In that moment, I felt an unexpected emotion: pity. He was still fighting old battles, using old weapons, while the world changed around him. Every attack, every scheme, every attempt at control just pushed more people toward the very changes he was trying to prevent. The soup incident had been his first major miscalculation, thinking he could use violence to maintain control. But his bigger mistake was not understanding that true strength isn't in the ability to dominate others, but in the courage to stand together against domination. As our security team documented his surveillance, adding it to our growing evidence file, I thought about how far we'd come. The woman he'd tried to silence was now leading a movement. The inheritance he'd tried to control was funding systemic change. The reputation he'd tried to destroy had become a symbol of resistance and renewal. We weren't just surviving his attacks anymore. We were transforming them into fuel for change. Each obstacle he created became a stepping stone toward our goals. Each attempt to divide us brought our community closer together. The battle wasn't over, but its nature had fundamentally changed. We weren't fighting against James anymore. We were building something bigger than his ability to comprehend or control. The email arrived at 3 a.m., its sender anonymous, its content explosive. "You're not the first," the subject line read. Attached were dozens of files, emails, text messages, and hospital records spanning 15 years, all documenting a pattern that went far beyond my personal experience with James. "Morgan," I called, though it was the middle of the night, "I need you to verify something." She arrived within an hour, still in her pajamas, laptop in hand. We spent the next several hours going through the files, cross-referencing names, dates, and incidents. What emerged was staggering: a systematic pattern of abuse and cover-ups involving not just James, but several senior doctors at the hospital. "This is from someone inside the system," Morgan said, tracing email threads. "Someone with high-level access to hospital records and board communications." The evidence was meticulous. There were records of complaints buried, careers derailed, women silenced through legal threats and professional blackmail. But most damning were the email exchanges between James and other doctors, discussing how to handle women who threatened their control. "Look at this," Morgan pointed to a particular email thread. 3 years ago, a resident filed a harassment complaint against one of James's colleagues. Within weeks, she was transferred to a different department. Her evaluation marks mysteriously dropped, and she eventually left medicine altogether. I remembered that resident, Sarah Mitchell. She'd been brilliant, dedicated, and then suddenly she was gone. James had said she couldn't handle the pressure. By morning, we had assembled a crisis team. Michael Chen reviewed the legal implications while Sarah Martinez prepared communication strategies. Dr. Walsh and her allies in the hospital administration needed to be briefed before everything broke. But first, we had to find our anonymous source. It didn't take long. Dr. Elizabeth Warner, the head of hospital records, requested an urgent meeting through secure channels. When we met in a private room at the public library, her hands shook as she clutched her coffee cup. "I've been collecting evidence for years," she explained. "Every resigned resident, every buried complaint, every suspicious transfer." I couldn't stop it then, but I documented everything. "Why now?" I asked. "Because of Amy," she said, referring to James's current resident. "Last week I overheard him using the same tactics, the same words he's used before. I couldn't let another promising career be destroyed. The next 48 hours were a whirlwind of activity. Our legal team worked to verify and organize the evidence. Dr. Walsh coordinated with hospital administration to protect potential victims. Security was increased around our office and the Vancouver construction site. Then, just as we were preparing to act, James made his final mistake. Amy, his resident, arrived at our office in tears. "He knows something's coming," she said. "He called me into his office, tried to make me sign a statement saying I've never experienced or witnessed any inappropriate behavior. When she refused, he'd become angry. He said he made my career, and he could break it just as easily." What James didn't know was that Amy had recorded the entire conversation. The next morning, as James arrived at the hospital for his rounds, he found the board of directors waiting in his office. Dr. Walsh led the meeting, presenting him with the mountain of evidence we'd accumulated. "This isn't just about one incident with soup anymore," she told him. "This is about 15 years of systematic abuse of power, documented and verified." James tried his usual tactics: denial, deflection, playing the dedicated healer too busy saving lives to engage in petty politics. But as each piece of evidence was presented, as each victim's story was laid out, his carefully constructed facade began to crack. The final blow came when Amy played her recording. James's mask slipped completely, his rage finally visible to the colleagues who'd enabled him for so long. "You're all making a terrible mistake," he snarled, looking around. "The room? Do you know how many lives I've saved? How many children would die without my skills?" "No one is questioning your surgical abilities," Dr. Walsh replied calmly. "But being good at your job doesn't give you the right to abuse your power." The board's decision was unanimous. James was suspended pending a full investigation, his hospital privileges revoked immediately. The medical board would be notified, and all his cases would be reviewed. But it went beyond just James. The evidence. Dr. Warner had implicated several other doctors in the systematic abuse of power. The entire power structure that had protected abusers was being dismantled. When I arrived at the Vancouver Centre construction site that afternoon, word had already spread. The workers, many of whom had wives or daughters in medical school, gave me a spontaneous round of applause. Looking at the rising framework of our building, I thought about how this project had evolved. What started as a personal journey of recovery had become a catalyst for systemic change. The soup James had thrown to assert his control had instead sparked a revolution. That evening, as my team celebrated this major victory, Amy approached me quietly. "I was ready to quit medicine," she said. "Before I found you, before I understood what was happening, I thought I was the problem. Now," she smiled, looking around at the supportive community we'd built. "Now I know I'm part of the solution." Her words echoed what Gran had always believed, that true healing comes not just from escaping abuse, but from transforming it into positive change. The construction crews worked late that night, their floodlights illuminating the Victorian mansion's facade. Each beam they raised, each wall they built, was another step toward creating the sanctuary Gran had envisioned, and that James had inadvertently helped strengthen. His attempt to silence me with a bowl of soup hadn't just failed, it had become the catalyst for exposing and dismantling the very system of power and control he'd relied on for so long. Spring came early to Vancouver that year. As the last construction equipment pulled away from the completed Vancouver Centre, I stood in Gran's, now my garden, watching the first roses begin to bloom. The renovation had preserved every inch of her carefully planned garden, incorporating it into the center's healing spaces. The transformation of the Victorian mansion and its surrounding buildings was stunning. The main house now hosted counseling, services, and support groups. Its grand parlors converted into warm, welcoming spaces that balanced historic charm with modern comfort. The carriage house had become a state-of-the-art design studio and business incubator. The commercial buildings housed everything from legal aid offices to art therapy studios. But it was the new addition that truly captured our vision. A glass-walled atrium connecting all the buildings filled with plants and natural light. We'd designed it to blend seamlessly with the historic structures while symbolizing transparency and growth. My phone buzzed with a text from Morgan. "Turn on Channel 4. They're covering the hospital board's announcement." The news showed the hospital's press conference, where they were announcing sweeping changes to their policies on harassment and abuse. Dr. Walsh stood at the podium, looking confident and determined. "The events of the past year have shown us that excellence in medical care must include excellence in how we treat each other," she was saying. "Today, we're implementing comprehensive reforms to ensure that no medical professional faces the kind of abuse and manipulation that was allowed to flourish under previous leadership." The camera panned to show Amy standing among the hospital staff, wearing her white coat proudly. She'd not only stayed in medicine, but had become an advocate for reform, helping develop new protocols for identifying and addressing abuse of power in medical settings. The changes went far beyond just our local hospital. Medical schools across the country were adopting similar policies, using our documentation and research to train the next generation of healthcare providers. "Ms. Shaw?" A voice interrupted my thoughts. I turned to see Maria, one of our first residents at the center, standing in the garden doorway. "The art therapy group is ready to start setting up their gallery space. Would you mind consulting on the layout?" Maria had joined us 3 months ago, escaping an abusive marriage with nothing but her children and her art supplies. Now she was coordinating our art therapy program, helping other survivors find their voice through creative expression. As we walked through the center, I saw dozens of similar transformations in progress. Linda, who'd refused James's bribes, was teaching financial literacy classes in our business center. Sarah Mitchell, the resident who'd left medicine, had returned to help develop our medical advocacy program. The building buzzed with activity, support groups meeting, classes in session, children playing in our secure daycare facility. Each space had been carefully designed to promote healing and empowerment, from the color schemes to the furniture arrangements. My design firm, now headquartered in the renovated carriage house, had evolved alongside the center. We'd become specialists in trauma-informed design, creating spaces that helped people feel safe and empowered. Our waiting list grew longer every week as more organizations sought to incorporate these principles. "Rebecca?" Morgan caught up with me as I finished consulting with the art therapy group. "The investigative committee wants to interview you again. They're expanding their investigation to other hospitals in the region." The investigation into James and his allies had snowballed, revealing similar patterns of abuse in medical institutions across the country. Each new revelation brought more survivors forward, more stories to document, more changes to implement. James himself had left Seattle, his medical license under review, his reputation in tatters. The last I'd heard, he'd moved to another state. But his attempt to start fresh had been complicated by the national attention our case had received. The medical community was no longer willing to turn a blind eye to abuse of power, no matter how skilled the surgeon. That evening, I hosted a small dinner party in my new apartment, a cozy space above the carriage house with views of the garden. Morgan, Lauren, Dr. Walsh, and other core team members gathered to celebrate the center's official opening. "Remember that night at Le Petit Bistro?" Lauren asked as we sat in my living room after dinner. "Did you ever imagine we'd end up here?" I touched the barely visible scars on my neck, thinking about how far we'd come. "No, but I think Gran did. She saw something in me I couldn't see in myself." "She saw a fighter," Morgan said, raising her glass. "And she gave you the tools you'd need for the battle." "Not just tools," I corrected, looking around at these women who'd become my family. "She gave me a foundation to build on. All of this, the center, the reforms, the community we've built, it's grown from what she started." Later, after my guests had left, I walked through the quiet center. The moonlight streaming through the atrium created patterns on the floor, like the shadows of leaves in wind. In the distance, I could see lights on in some of the residential units where survivors were beginning their own journeys of recovery. Standing in what used to be Grand's library, now a comfortable meeting space for support groups, I felt a profound sense of rightness. James had thrown that soup thinking it would break me, force me back into line. Instead, it had burned away, the last of my doubts, revealing the strength that had been there all along. The scars had faded, but their impact lived on in every life touched by the center. Every policy changed, every survivor who found their voice. We hadn't just survived, we'd created something powerful and lasting from the ashes of abuse. As I, locked up for the night, I paused in the garden one last time. Grand's roses were blooming more abundantly than ever, their fragrance filling the evening air. Like the women we helped, like the community we'd built, like me. Sometimes the deepest wounds become the soil from which the most beautiful things grow. The call came on a Tuesday morning as I was reviewing designs for our newest project, a women's health clinic in Portland that wanted to incorporate our trauma-informed design principles. Ms. Shaw? The voice was hesitant, young. My name is Jessica Martinez. I'm a surgical resident at Boston General. I saw your TED Talk about recognizing patterns of abuse in medical institutions, and I need your help. The TED Talk had been Dr. Walsh's idea, a way to share our message beyond the Pacific Northwest. I'd been reluctant at first, but standing on that red circle, sharing my story and the larger patterns we'd uncovered, had opened floodgates. Jessica wasn't the first medical professional to reach out, and she wouldn't be the last. There's a surgeon here, she continued, her voice dropping to nearly a whisper. He reminds me so much of James. The way he isolates residents, the subtle threats, the manipulation. Nobody believes us because he's so respected, so successful. I listened as she detailed patterns I knew all too well, the same tactics, the same abuse of power, just with different names and faces. When she finished, I didn't offer empty reassurances. Instead, I asked, how many other residents are willing to speak up? 4 of us, maybe more. But we're scared. We've seen what happens to people who challenge him. Check your email in an hour, I told her. I'm connecting you with our medical advocacy team. You're not alone anymore. After hanging up, I called an emergency meeting with our core team. Within hours, we had mobilized resources, legal, support, documentation protocols, safety planning. Dr. Walsh reached out to her contacts at Boston General. Lauren coordinated with medical advocacy groups in the area. This was what the Vancouver Center had evolved into, not just a local refuge, but a hub for systemic change. We'd developed a blueprint for exposing and addressing abuse of power in medical institutions, and now we were helping others implement it across the country. Later that day, I gave a workshop for new residents at our center. The room was full of women at different stages of their healing journeys, some still bearing visible bruises, others further along their path to recovery. The hardest part, I told them, touching the faded scars on my neck, isn't leaving. It's believing you deserve better. That's what abusers take from you first, your belief in your own worth. A woman in the back raised her hand. How did you know? That it wasn't your fault? That you weren't overreacting? I smiled, remembering my own doubts. I had help. My grandmother left me more than just property. She left me proof that I could be strong. But not everyone has that. That's why we're here. To be each other's proof, each other's strength. The workshop turned into an impromptu sharing session. Each woman's story was unique, but the patterns were painfully familiar. The isolation, the self-doubt, the careful way abusers chose their victims and maintained control. Look around this room, I said as we concluded. Every person here was chosen because their abuser thought they were weak. But weak people don't survive what you've survived. Weak people don't rebuild their lives. Weak people don't sit in rooms like this, planning how to help others. After the workshop, Morgan showed me the latest statistics. The Vancouver Centre had helped over 200 women directly in its first year, but our indirect impact was even greater. Our advocacy work had led to policy changes in 12 hospitals. Our design principles were being implemented in women's clinics across 3 countries. Our research was being used to train new medical professionals about abuse of power. "We're going to need a bigger building," Morgan joked, but there was truth in her humor. We were outgrowing our space, even with the recent renovation. That evening, I had dinner with Dr. Patricia Chen, who'd become a close friend and ally. She'd just returned from a medical conference where she'd presented our findings on systemic abuse in healthcare. "The old guard is finally listening," she said, her eyes bright with excitement. "They can't ignore the evidence anymore. Every hospital, every medical school is being forced to confront these issues." "Because survivors are speaking up," I added, thinking of Jessica and countless others who'd found their voice. "Because you spoke up first," Patricia corrected. "That night at the gala when you stood up to James, you showed others it was possible." I shook my head. "Gran showed me first. Every woman who escapes abuse shows someone else it's possible. We're all just paying it forward." Later, working late in my office, I received an email from Jessica. She and her fellow residents had documented everything, following our protocols. Their evidence was solid, their support network in place. They were ready to act. "Thank you," she wrote, "not just for the help, but for showing us we're not crazy, we're not alone, and we're not powerless." I thought about James, about how he'd tried to isolate and silence me, how that bowl of soup had been meant to scald me into submission. Instead, it had forged connections that were helping others break free from similar abuse. Looking out my window at the garden where Gran's roses still bloomed, I saw a group of women walking together, deep in conversation, survivors supporting each other, sharing strength, building community. The light was fading, but they carried their own illumination, the glow of people who had reclaimed their power and were helping others do the same. That's when I truly understood what Gran had built, what she'd prepared me to continue. It wasn't just about providing shelter or services. It was about creating a chain reaction of empowerment, each survivor becoming a beacon for others, each story of healing lighting the way for someone else's journey. The scars from that bowl of soup had long since faded, but their impact continued to spread, rippling outward in waves of change that would touch lives far beyond anything James could have imagined when he tried to silence me. The news broke like a thunderclap on an otherwise peaceful morning. "Renowned surgeon claims conspiracy and license review," screamed the headlines. James had gone on the offensive, giving an exclusive interview to a major news network where he painted himself as the victim of a coordinated campaign to destroy his career. "These allegations are false," he declared, looking directly into the camera with the same controlled intensity I remembered so well. "My ex-wife and her allies have fabricated evidence, manipulated vulnerable residents, all to further their own agenda. They're destroying the careers of dedicated physicians and endangering children who need life-saving care." He'd timed it perfectly, just as the medical board was preparing to make their final decision about his license. The interview was masterfully crafted, hitting all the right emotional notes. He spoke about children he'd saved, families he'd helped, his decades of service to the medical community. "This isn't just about my license," he said, his voice catching slightly. "It's about every doctor who might hesitate to properly discipline an underperforming resident, every surgeon who might second-guess a necessary correction, all because they're afraid of being labeled abusive." Within hours, social media was ablaze. Old patients came forward defending him. Conservative commentators decried cancel culture in medicine. Questions were raised about our evidence, our motives, Our methods. He's trying to poison the well before the medical board's decision, Michael observed during our emergency strategy meeting. Make them afraid of setting a precedent. But James had miscalculated. He'd forgotten about Dr. Elizabeth Warner and her years of meticulous documentation. He'd forgotten about the security footage from Le Petit Bistro. Most importantly, he'd forgotten about the countless women who'd found their voice through our work. They began speaking up. First a trickle, then a flood. Former patients who'd witnessed his behavior, nurses who'd seen his abuse of power, administrators who'd buried complaints. Each had their own story, their own evidence, their own truth to share. Then came the unexpected ally, James's first wife. She'd maintained her silence for 20 years, bound by a strict NDA. But watching his interview, seeing him attempt to rewrite history, she decided enough was enough. "I've been silent too long," she said, standing beside me at our own press conference. The night he threw that soup wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern, one I recognized because I'd lived it. The only difference is that Rebecca had the strength and support to fight back. The medical board's hearing room was packed. James arrived with an entourage of supporters, still playing the role of the dedicated healer being persecuted by vindictive women. But as the evidence was presented, not just about the soup incident, but about 2 decades of systematic abuse, his facade began to crack. Dr. Warner's documentation was devastating. Every incident, every complaint, every cover-up meticulously recorded. The pattern was undeniable, the evidence overwhelming. But the most powerful testimony came from Amy, the resident whose courage had helped expose everything. She stood before the board, her voice steady as she described the manipulation, the threats, the careful way James had tried to make her doubt her own perceptions. "He told me I was weak," she said, looking directly at him, "that I'd never survive. In medicine, if I couldn't handle criticism. But real strength isn't in enduring abuse, it's in standing up to it." James's response was predictable. He attempted to paint Amy as unstable, unreliable, unable to handle the pressures of residency. But with each attack, with each attempt to discredit his accusers, he only proved our point about the systematic way he abused power. The medical board's decision was unanimous. James's license was permanently revoked. More importantly, they issued new guidelines for addressing abuse of power in medical institutions, using our documentation as a framework for reform. But James had one final card to play. As we left the hearing, his lawyer served us with a massive lawsuit, claiming defamation, conspiracy, and intentional interference with his career. The damages sought would have bankrupted the Vancouver Center. "He thinks he can silence us with legal fees," Morgan said, reviewing the lawsuit. "Make us too busy fighting in court to continue our work." That's when our community showed its true strength. Law firms offered pro bono services. Medical professionals started a legal defense fund. Survivors organized fundraisers. What James intended as a devastating blow became another opportunity for collective action. The lawsuit dragged on for months, but we didn't slow down. The Vancouver Center continued its work. More survivors came forward. More institutions adopted our protocols. The movement James had tried to stop kept growing stronger. The final hearing was held on a rainy Tuesday. James arrived looking less polished than usual, the strain of the past months visible on his face. As the judge prepared to announce her decision, I found myself studying him, trying to understand how someone so skilled at healing bodies could be so blind to the harm he caused to spirits. The judge's ruling was comprehensive. Not only was the lawsuit dismissed, but James was ordered to pay all legal costs. More importantly, the ruling explicitly recognized the legitimacy of our work in exposing systematic abuse. "The court finds," the judge declared, "that the defendant's actions in documenting and exposing patterns of abuse serve a vital public interest. The plaintiff's attempt to silence them through legal action is itself an abuse of the court system." As James stormed out of the courtroom, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. How small he looked without his carefully constructed facade of power. The man who had once terrified me with a bowl of soup now seemed diminished, reduced to his true size by the light of truth. That evening, we held an impromptu celebration at the Vancouver Center. Survivors, supporters, and staff gathered in the garden where Grand's roses bloomed defiantly against the autumn chill. Looking around at these faces, some bearing visible scars, others carrying wounds only they could see, I saw not victims, but warriors. Each person there had faced their own James, their own bowl of soup, their own moment of choice between silence and truth. The scars on my neck had faded to nearly nothing, but their legacy lived on in every life touched by our work, every policy changed, every survivor who found their voice. What James had intended as an act of domination had instead become a catalyst for transformation. As the sun set, casting long shadows through Grand's garden, I thought about how she would have loved this moment. She'd known, somehow, that the inheritance she left wasn't just about property or money. It was about creating a space where healing could happen, where strength could be found, where truth could overcome the silence that protects abusers. The rare, final challenge hadn't broken us. It had only proved how unbreakable we'd become. The divorce became final on a bright spring morning, almost 2 years to the day after that fateful dinner at Le Petit Bistrot. I sat in the courthouse, watching as years of marriage were officially dissolved with the stroke of a judge's pen. James wasn't present. He'd moved to Arizona after losing his medical license, attempting to rebuild his life far from the community he'd once dominated. The terms were clear and final. I retained full ownership of the Vancouver Center properties, my design firm, and all assets from Grand's inheritance. James kept his surgical equipment, his investments, and the condo in Seattle that had once been our home. The restraining order was made permanent, and he was barred from any contact with the Vancouver Center or its affiliates. "It's really over," Morgan said as we left the courthouse. The morning sun caught the silver threads in her hair. When had those appeared? We'd all aged years in these months of battle, but it was the kind of aging that brought wisdom rather than weariness. "The divorce is over," I corrected her, "but our work is just beginning." Back at the center, a different kind of ceremony was taking place. 20 women were graduating from our first comprehensive recovery program, a 6-month course that combined therapy, career development, and life skills training. Each graduate had their own story, their own journey from victim to survivor to thriver. Maria, our art therapy coordinator, had organized an exhibition of their work in the atrium. Paintings, sculptures, and multimedia pieces filled the space, each telling a story of transformation. The piece that caught everyone's attention was a collaborative installation, hundreds of broken dishes and cups, reformed into a stunning mosaic that spelled out "unbreakable." "We used soup bowls," Maria explained, her eyes twinkling. "Seemed appropriate." Dr. Walsh arrived just as the graduation ceremony was beginning. She'd stepped down as Chief of Emergency Medicine to focus full-time on reforming medical education, using our documentation and research to develop new protocols for identifying and preventing abuse of power. "The medical board adopted our comprehensive reforms today," she announced quietly as we watched the graduates receive their certificates. "Every hospital in the state will be required to implement abuse prevention protocols. They're calling it the Vancouver Standard." The news felt like the closing of a circle. What had started with one man's abuse of power in a French restaurant had led to systemic change in the very institutions that had protected abusers for so long. Linda, one of our graduates, took the podium to give the commencement speech. 2 years ago, she'd arrived at our door with nothing but her children and a few hastily packed bags. Now she stood tall, confident, her voice steady as she addressed her fellow survivors. "When I first came here," she said, "I thought I was broken, that the soup incident was somehow my fault, that I deserved the abuse because I wasn't strong enough, smart enough, Good enough? But look at us now. She gestured to her classmates, to the staff, to the community that had grown around the center. We're not just survivors anymore. We're leaders, creators, champions for change. Every piece of art in this room, every skill we've learned, every obstacle we've overcome, they're proof that what was meant to break us has only made us stronger. After the ceremony, as the graduates celebrated with their families in the garden, I found myself drawn to Gran's old library. We'd preserved it as a quiet space for reflection, keeping her books and adding new ones donated by survivors and supporters. On her desk, now used as a display for historical documents, sat the letter she'd left me with her will. The paper had yellowed slightly, but her words remained as clear and powerful as the day I'd first read them. My dearest little bird, by the time you read this, you'll have faced your moment of truth. We all do, sooner or later. The test isn't in avoiding these moments, but in how we rise from them. Remember, the same heat that burns can also forge something unbreakable. She'd known, somehow, not the specifics, but the pattern. She'd seen in James what I hadn't been able to see, and she'd prepared me not just to survive, but to transform survival into something greater. Morgan found me there, still holding Gran's letter. The board of directors meeting is about to start, she reminded me. We're voting on the expansion proposal. The Vancouver Centre had outgrown its original facilities. Women were coming from across the country, seeking not just refuge, but transformation. Our waiting list for services grew longer every week. In the boardroom, now housed in what had once been Gran's formal dining room, our team assembled. Dr. Walsh, Lauren, Sarah Martinez, and other key partners joined via video conference. The expansion plans were ambitious. New facilities in 3 cities, partnerships with major medical institutions, research programs to document and prevent abuse. It's a big step, Michael cautioned. Are we ready? I looked around the room, at these faces that had become family. At Morgan, who'd grown from assistant to full partner. At Maria, whose art therapy program was being studied by universities. At Linda, newly elected to our board of directors, bringing a survivor's perspective to our leadership. We've been ready since the night James threw that soup, I said. He thought he was showing his power. Instead, he showed us ours. The vote was unanimous. As we adjourned, I walked through the center one last time that evening. In the art therapy studio, new works were taking shape. In the business incubator, women were building their futures. In the garden, Gran's roses bloomed alongside new plantings, a symbol of how growth builds on what came before. The divorce papers in my bag felt light, just pieces of paper marking the end of something that had died long ago. But all around me, life was flourishing. The Vancouver Centre wasn't just a place of healing anymore. It was a source of transformation, a catalyst for change that would ripple out far beyond these walls. James had tried to silence me with a bowl of soup. Instead, he'd helped create a chorus of voices that could never be silenced again. The scars had faded, but the strength they'd revealed would last forever. 5 years to the day after James threw that bowl of soup in my face, I stood on the stage at the National Conference on Domestic Violence Prevention, looking out at a sea of faces. Survivors, advocates, medical professionals, all gathered to learn from our experience at the Vancouver Centre. The original center had grown into a network of facilities across North America, each implementing our integrated approach to healing and empowerment. Our trauma-informed design principles had become the industry standard for women's shelters and recovery centers. The medical reforms we'd sparked had led to fundamental changes in how power dynamics were handled in healthcare settings. But more important than the institutional changes were the personal transformations. In the audience, I could see familiar faces. Linda, now running her own financial empowerment program for survivors. Amy, who'd completed her residency and was revolutionizing medical education. Maria, whose art therapy techniques were being taught in universities. 5 years ago, I began, touching the now invisible scars on my neck. A bowl of French onion soup changed my life. My then-husband thought he was teaching me a lesson about power. He was right, just not in the way he intended. The laughter that rippled through the audience carried understanding. These were people who knew that sometimes the weapons meant to break us become the tools that forge us stronger. The Vancouver Center wasn't built because of that incident, I continued. It was built because of what came after, the community that formed, the strength we found in each other, the changes we discovered we could make when we stood together. As I spoke, I saw Morgan at the back of the hall, coordinating with our team. She'd grown into a powerful advocate in her own right, developing programs to help employers identify and prevent workplace abuse. Dr. Walsh sat in the front row, now heading a national initiative to reform medical education. Lauren had brought her entire hospital advocacy team, their success in implementing our protocols making them models for other institutions. But the real story isn't about buildings or programs, I said. It's about each person who finds their voice, who discovers their strength, who transforms their pain into power. It's about the moment when you realize that what was meant to silence you has given you something to say. After the speech, during the reception, women approached me one by one to share their stories. Each had their own version of a soup incident, the moment when abuse had tried to break them, and they'd found the strength to fight back instead. Sarah Martinez, our PR consultant turned communications director, joined me as the crowd thinned. "Have you seen the latest numbers?" she asked. The Vancouver Standard has been adopted by medical institutions in 12 countries. The documentary about our work is being translated into 15 languages. But the statistics that meant the most to me weren't about institutional change. They were about individual transformations. The number of women who'd found safety in our shelters, started businesses through our incubator program, rebuilt their lives with our support. Later that evening, I returned to Vancouver, to the garden where it had all begun. Grand's roses still bloomed, tended now by survivors who found healing in nurturing new growth. The Victorian mansion had been joined by modern buildings, each designed to balance beauty with security, history with hope. Morgan found me there as she so often did when I needed grounding. "Thinking about Gran?" she asked, joining me on the garden bench. "Thinking about everything," I admitted. How one moment of violence was meant to enforce silence but ended up creating all of this instead. We sat quietly, watching the sunset paint the buildings in shades of gold. In the distance, I could hear voices from the evening support group, women sharing their stories, finding strength in community just as I had. "You know what I realized?" Morgan said finally. "James thought throwing that soup would show his power over you. Instead, it showed him something he never expected. That real power isn't in the ability to hurt someone, but in the strength to heal, to grow, to help others do the same." She was right. Every attempt James had made to silence and control me had instead created ripples of change that continued to spread. The soup that was meant to scald me into submission had instead heated a revolution that was transforming lives across continents. My phone buzzed with a message from Amy. Her medical education reform proposal had just been approved for national implementation. Another message from Linda showed photos of her latest graduate class, women beaming with newfound financial independence. Maria sent an image of her latest art installation, a powerful piece about transformation and healing. These were the true measures of our success, not in buildings built or policies changed, but in lives transformed, in strength discovered, in voices found. As darkness fell, the center's lights came on, creating a warm glow that reached into the garden. Through the windows, I could see women gathering for evening programs, children playing in the secure daycare, staff and volunteers moving purposefully through the spaces we'd created together. The scars from that bowl of soup had long since faded, but their impact lived on in every life touched by our work, every survivor who found their voice, every person who discovered their own strength through helping others. Gran had known, somehow, that the inheritance she left me wasn't just about property or money. It was about creating space for transformation, about turning pain into purpose, about building something that would outlast any attempt to silence or control. As I walked through the garden one last time that night, I thought about all the women yet to come, all the stories yet to be transformed, all the strength yet to be discovered. The soup that was meant to break me had instead helped forge a legacy of healing and hope that would continue long after the scars had faded. The night James threw that soup, he thought he was ending something. Instead, he'd helped begin something far more powerful than he could have imagined. A movement that would continue to grow, to heal, to transform lives long after the heat of that moment had cooled.